This is Audible.
Recorded Books and One Click Digital present What Angels Fear by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter. No place so sacred from such fops is barred, nor is Paul's church more safe than Paul's churchyard. Nay, fly to altars, there they'll talk you dead. For fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Alexander Pope, An Essay on Criticism. Prologue, Tuesday, 29th of January, 1811. She blamed the fog. She wasn't normally this nervous, this afraid. It was such a foul, creeping thing, the yellow fog of London. Even without the fog it would have been dark at this hour, dark and January cold. But the murky vapour made it worse, wrapping around her lantern in wraith-like drifts that had Rachel stumbling as she cut across the churchyard. A loose stone rolled beneath the delicate sole of one kid half-boot, the clatter sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Pausing, Rachel threw a quick glance over her shoulder, her gaze raking the faint mist-shrouded outlines of the graveyard's scattered monuments and tombstones. From the distance came a clacking rattle and the fog-muffled voice of the Charlie calling out the time. Rachel drew in a deep breath of frosty air, tinged with the scent of wet earth and leaves, and a stale, musty hint of old death, and hurried on. The heavy stone bulk of St. Matthew of the Fields loomed before her. Rachel clutched the satin-lined velvet folds of her evening cloak more closely about her. She should have told him to meet her at 8:30, she decided. 9 at the latest. It was the usual time, 8:30. Only this wasn't a usual transaction. She hadn't expected to be so edgy. It was a sensation she didn't like. Being nervous made her feel like a victim, and Rachel York refused to play the role of victim. Never again. It was a promise she'd made to herself at the age of 15, and in the 3 years that had passed since that fateful night when she'd seized control of her own life. It was a promise she'd never broken. She wasn't about to break it now. At the steps leading up to the north transept door, she paused again. Beneath the deep round arch of the side portal, the darkness was nearly complete. Lifting the lantern high, she let the narrowed beam of light play over the door's weathered old oak. Through the thin kid of her gloves, the iron key felt cold and heavy in her hand. To her annoyance, her fingers shook when she thrust the toothed end into the lock. With one twist, the mechanism clicked smoothly, and the door swung silently inward before her on oiled hinges. The Reverend MacDermot was careful about such things, but then he needed to be. Rachel pushed the door open wider, one artfully curled lock of golden hair fluttering against her cheek in the sudden outward gush of air. Familiar church smells engulfed her, the scent of beeswax and damp stone and ancient wood. She whisked herself inside, carefully closing the door behind her. She didn't lock it. She dropped the key into her reticule, felt its weight heavy and solid against her thigh as she crossed the transept. The cold silence of the church closed around her, the light from her lantern wavering over candle-blackened stone walls, and the scattered recumbent figures of entombed ladies and long-dead knights lying still and cold in the empty hush. They said it was close on to 800 years old, St. Matthew of the Fields, with moulded sandstone arches that sprang from thick cylindrical piers, and small high windows that now showed only blackness beyond. Rachel's father had been interested in such things. Once he had taken her to see the cathedral in Worcester, and talked to her for hours about arcades and triforiums and rood screens. But her father was long dead. Rachel shut her mind against the memory, unsure what had brought such a thought to her now. The Lady Chapel lay at the far end of the apse, a tiny 14th-century jewel of white marble and slender columns, and delicately carved screenwork. Rachel set her lantern on the steps before the altar. She was early. He wouldn't be here for another 20 minutes or more. The emptiness of the ancient church seemed to press in upon her, cold and dark. She found her gaze returning again and again to the blessed candles clustered together on the snowy linen of the altar-cloth. For a moment longer she hesitated. Then, kindling a taper, she began to light the candles one after the other, their golden flames leaping up warm and bright until they seemed to merge into one comforting glow. Rachel gazed up at the massive canvas that hung above the altar, a darkly swirled depiction of the Virgin Mother ascending gloriously into the heavens against a background of triumphant angels. Once, Rachel might have murmured a soft prayer. Not now. She didn't hear the transept door open and close, only the faint echo of stealthy footsteps along the choir. He was early. She hadn't expected it of him. Turning, she shoved back the hood of her cloak and forced her lips into a practised smile, ready to play her role. She could see him now, a faint shadow, the outline of his greatcoat and top hat just visible through the Lady Chapel's intricately carved stone screen. Then he moved into the candlelight. She took a quick step back. "You," she whispered, and knew she'd made a terrible mistake. Chapter 1. Wednesday, 30th of January, 1811. Sebastian could hear the tolling of the city's church bells counting out the hour, dull echoes of sound muffled by distance, and the acrid fog that even here hugged the open ground and shrouded the bare, reaching branches of the stand of elms that grew at the edge of the field. Dawn had come, but it brought little warmth or light. Sebastian Alistair St. Cyr, Viscount Devlin, only surviving son and heir to the Earl of Hendon, propped his shoulders against the high side of his curricle, crossed his arms at his chest, and thought about his bed. It had been a long night, a night of brandy fumes and cigar smoke, of Pharaoh and 21, and a promise made to a sad-eyed woman, a promise that he would not kill, however much the man he had come here to meet might deserve killing. Sebastian tipped back his head and closed his eyes. He could hear the sweet call of a lark at the far end of the field, and nearer, the steady swish-swish of wet grass as his second, Sir Christopher Farrell, paced back and forth in the roadside's verge. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. "Maybe he won't show," said Sir Christopher. Sebastian kept his eyes closed. "He'll show." The pacing resumed, back and forth, boot heels squelching in the damp earth. "If you're not careful," said Sebastian, "you're going to get mud on your boots." "To hell with my boots! Are you certain Talbot is bringing a doctor?" "How good of a doctor? Maybe we should have brought our own doctor." Sebastian lowered his head and opened his eyes. "I don't intend to get shot." Sir Christopher swung about, his fair hair curling wildly in the damp mist, his normally soft grey eyes dilated. "Right. Well, that's reassuring. Doubtless Lord Firth had every intention of not getting shot when he stood up against Maynard last month. Pity, of course, that the bullet went through his neck." Sebastian smiled. "I'm delighted to see I'm amusing you. This is another of those advantages of having gone to war, is it? Staring with calm disdain into the face of death. Ranks right up there with being rendered irresistibly fascinating to members of the fair sex." Sebastian laughed out loud. Christopher smiled himself, then resumed his silent pacing. A slim, flawlessly tailored figure in buckskins and high-gloss top boots, and well-laundered linen. After another moment he said, "I still don't understand why you didn't choose swords. Less chance of someone accidentally getting killed with swords." Lifting his left arm in a fencer's pose, he pantomimed a quick thrust against the cold, misty air. A neat little pink through the shoulder, a bloody scratch on the arm, and honour is satisfied. "Talbot intends to kill me." Christopher let his arms fall to his sides. So you're just going to stand there and let him take a shot at you?
Talbot couldn't hit a ship of the line at 25 paces.
Sebastian yawned.
I'm surprised he chose it.
It was the code duello. As the challenged party, Sebastian selected the weapons, but the choice of distance then fell to the challenger. Christopher scrubbed an open hand across his face.
I've heard rumours. Here he comes, said Sebastian.
Straightening, he swung off his driving coat and slung it over the high seat of the curricle. Christopher turned to stare into the opaque distance.
Bloody hell, even you can't see in this fog.
No, but I have ears.
So do I, and I don't hear a thing. I swear, Sebastian, you must be part bat. It's unnatural.
A minute or two later, a carriage appeared out of the gloom, a pair of showy blacks pulling a high-perch phaeton containing 2 men, and followed at a discreet distance by a simple gig. The doctor. A tall, lanky man with straight, thinning brown hair and an aquiline nose jumped down from the phaeton's high seat. Across the mist-blown field, Captain John Talbot's gaze met and held Sebastian's for one long moment. Then he turned away to strip off his coat and gloves.
"Right then,"
called the captain's second, a mustachioed military man who clapped his hands together in a false show of heartiness.
"Let's get to it, shall we?"
"Those rumours I mentioned," Christopher said in an undertone as he and Sebastian moved forward. "They say the last time Talbot fought a duel, he chose 25 paces, then turned and fired after 12. Killed a man. Of course, Talbot and his second swore the distance had been settled at 12 paces all along."
"And his rival's second shut up about it when Talbot threatened to call him out for naming Talbot a liar."
Sebastian gave his friend a slow smile.
"Then if Talbot should have occasion to call you out for similar reason, I suggest you choose swords." "You have the pistols?" said Talbot's second as Sir Christopher walked up to him.
A brace of pistols in a blue velvet-lined walnut box was produced, inspected, and loaded by the seconds. Talbot made his choice. Sebastian took the other pistol in his hand, felt the cool, familiar weight against his palm, the deadly hardness of steel against his curled finger.
"Ready, gentlemen."
Back to back they stood, then began to walk, each step measured to the steady drone of the counted paces.
1, 2...
The doctor ostentatiously turned his back, but Christopher stood his ground, his eyes narrowed and watchful, his face pale, anxious. Sebastian knew his friend wasn't only worried about Talbot's intentions, that Christopher had other misgivings. Christopher didn't understand that there was a fine line between seeking death and being indifferent to its occurrence. A line Sebastian had yet to cross.
3, 4...
He had an unexpected memory of a misty summer morning long ago on a grassy slope near the hall, when his 2 older brothers had still been alive, and his mother. The air had smelled of the fresh scones they'd brought for tea, and ferns, and the restless sea beating against the rocks in the cove far below. They'd played drakes and dragons that morning, the 4 of them, counting out the movements. 5, 6, as they wove in and out, even his mother, her head thrown back, laughing, the strengthening sun bright on her golden hair. Only his sister Amanda had sat aloof, as she always did, aloof and disapproving and angry for reasons Sebastian never quite understood.
8, 9...
The metal of the pistol's trigger felt cold and solid against Sebastian's finger. The wind-swirled mist damp against his cheeks. He forced himself to focus on this moment, this place. The lark called again, from nearer the base of the hill. He could hear the gurgle of a distant stream, the clip-clop of a horse ridden at a slow trot up the road.
10, 11... It was the hesitation in the other man's stride between the 10th and 11th count that warned him. That, and the whisper of cloth rubbing against cloth as Talbot turned. 12. Sebastian spun about and dropped into a crouch at the precise moment that John Talbot fired, so that the bullet, intended for Sebastian's heart, grazed his forehead instead. Then, gun empty and dangling slack in his hand, Talbot had no choice but to stand, body turned sideways, jaw clenched tight, nostrils flaring with each indrawn breath as he waited for Sebastian's shot. Calmly, purposefully, Sebastian raised his pistol, took aim, and fired. Captain Talbot let out a sharp cry and pitched forward. The doctor scrambled out of the gig and ran toward him. "Bloody hell, Sebastian," said Christopher. "You've killed him." "Hardly." Sebastian let the pistol fall to his side. "But I imagine he'll find it damned uncomfortable to sit down for a while." I say, blustered Talbot second, his moustache working back and forth. "Most ungentlemanly conduct, this. Englishmen stand and fire weapons from their feet. Someone ought to fetch the constables. There'll be murder charges brought for this, mark my words." "Be quiet, man," said the doctor, snapping open his case. "No one I've treated yet has died from being clipped across the arse." Sir Christopher began to laugh, while Sebastian stretched to his feet and walked across the field to collect the other pistol. He'd promised Melanie he wouldn't kill her husband, but she hadn't said anything about not making the bastards suffer. Chapter 2. It was in the retro choir that Jem first noticed the blood. He'd known something was wrong before that, of course. Known it as soon as he opened the north transept door. For 30 years now, Jem Cummings had been sexton here at St. Matthew's of the Fields. It was part of his job to see that the church was locked up tight every night and unlocked again the next morning. So Jem knew. They had a young rector what had taken over the living 3 years ago. The Reverend MacDermot he was. MacDermot hadn't liked the idea of keeping the church locked at night, but then Jem had told him about that time back in '92 when them bloodthirsty heathen frogs had been rampaging across the channel, and the old reverend had come in one morning to find the high altar smashed and pig's blood splattered across the choir walls. When he heard about that, Reverend MacDermot dropped his talk about leaving the church open real quick. It was the pig's blood that Jem was remembering now as he staggered toward the nave, his bum leg hurting bad in the damp cold, his eyes straining as he peered into the early morning gloom. Yet the peace of the church seemed undisturbed, the high altar pristine and untouched, the sacristy door protecting the church's precious consecrated vessels solid and locked. The pounding of Jem's heart began to ease. Then he saw the blood. He didn't know what it was at first. Only dark smudges, faint but growing more distinct, more discernibly in the shape of men's shoe prints as he traced the trail across the worn paving slabs toward the Lady Chapel. The cold of the ancient stone wall seemed to seep into his very bones, his breath coming ragged in his tight chest as he crept forward, his body shaking so badly he had to clench his teeth to keep them from rattling. She lay on her back, sprawled in an obscene posture against the polished marble steps that led up to the chapel's altar. He saw bare thighs spread wide and gleaming white in the lamplight. A froth of lace edged what had once been a fine satin flounce, torn now, and stained with the same darkness that smeared her thighs. Eyes wide and glassy stared at him from beneath a head of golden curls tipped back at an unnatural angle. At first he thought the front of her gown was black, but as he inched closer, he saw the gaping gashes across her throat, and he understood. He understood, too, where all the blood had come from. It was everywhere. The blood, worse even than that long-ago day when the Jacobin fanatic had thrown buckets of the stuff around the choir. Only this wasn't pig's blood. It was her blood. Jem stumbled backward, his elbow knocking painfully against the edge of the Lady Chapel's intricately carved stone screen as he squeezed his eyes shut, blocking out that horrific vision. But nothing would ever blot out that smell, the cloying, sickening mingling of blood and candle wax and raw, sexual fulfillment. Chapter 3. It was almost noon by now, but the light filtering down through the stained glass windows in the apse of St. Matthew's of the Fields was still feeble, diffuse. Sir Henry Lovejoy, Chief Magistrate for Westminster at Queen Square, let his gaze travel over the blood-splattered chapel walls, the thick pools of congealing gore standing out dark and cruel against the white marble of the altar steps. He had a theory that the incidence of crimes of violence and passion was higher on those days when the yellow fog held London in its choking, deadly grip. But it had been a long time since London had seen a crime like this one. To one side of the Lady Chapel, a small, ominously still form lay hidden beneath a cloth stained dark and stiff, with so much blood that Lovejoy had to force himself to walk over to it. Bending, he flipped back the edge of the fabric and sighed. She'd been pretty once, this woman, and young. Any untimely death was tragic, of course, but no man who'd ever loved a woman, or watched with pride and fear the tentative first steps of a child, could look upon that youthful loveliness and not experience an added weight of sorrow, an extra edge to his sense of outrage. His knees creaking in complaint, Lovejoy lowered himself into a squat, his gaze still fixed on that pale, blood-streaked face. "Know who she is?" The question was addressed to the only other person in the chapel, a tall, well-built man in his mid-30s, with fair, fashionably dishevelled hair and an intricately tied cravat. As Queen Square's senior constable, Edward Maitland had been the first authority of any consequence called to the scene, and had been the one handling the investigation to this point. "An actress," he said now, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, his weight rocking back and forth from the balls of his feet, as if to contain his impatience with Sir Henry's slow, methodical ways. Miss Rachel York." "Ah, I thought she looked familiar." Swallowing hard, Lovejoy eased the cloth from the rest of the girl's body and forced himself to look. Her throat had been repeatedly, viciously slashed in long, savage gashes, which explained the sprays of blood on the walls, he supposed. So much blood everywhere. Yet Rachel York's death had not been quick or easy. Her fists were clenched as if in endurance, and bruises showed dark and ugly against the pale, bare flesh of her wrists and forearms. The skin, high on her left cheek, had been split by a harsh blow. The torn, disarrayed emerald satin gown and ripped velvet pelisse told their own story. "He had his way with her, I take it," said Lovejoy. Maitland shifted his weight back onto the heels of his expensive boots and balanced there, his gaze not on the girl, but on the high blue and red stained glass of the eastern window. "Yes, sir, no doubt about that." No doubt indeed, thought Lovejoy. The inescapable tang of semen still hung in the air, mingling with the heavy metallic odour of blood and the pious sweetness of incense and beeswax. He let his gaze travel over the girl's carefully composed limbs and frowned. "She was lying like this when you found her?" "No, sir. She was there, before the altar. Weren't proper to leave her that way, this being a church and all." Lovejoy straightened, his gaze drifting back to those blood-smeared marble steps. Every candle on the altar had guttered down and gone out. She must have lit them all, he thought, before she died. Why? In piety? Or because she was afraid of the dark? Aloud he said, "What was she doing here, do you suppose?"
Maitland's brows twitched together in a swift betraying movement, instantly stilled. It was obviously a question that hadn't occurred to him.
"That I can't say, sir. The sexton found her when he came to open the church this morning."
He pulled a notebook from the pocket of his greatcoat and flipped it open with the ostentatious display of attention to detail that sometimes grated on Lovejoy's nerves.
Mr. Jem Cummings. Neither he nor the Reverend," there was a brief ruffling of pages, "Reverend James McDermott, say they've ever seen her before." "They lock the church every night, do they?" "Yes, sir."
Again Maitland consulted his notebook.
"At 8 sharp."
Reaching down, Lovejoy carefully replaced the cloth over what was left of Rachel York, only pausing at the last moment to study once again that pale, beautiful face. She had a French look about her, with the fair curls and widely spaced brown eyes and short upper lip often found in Normandy. He'd seen her just last week with Cat Boleyn in the Covent Garden Theatre's production of As You Like It. Seen her and admired her, not simply for her beauty, but for her talent. He had a clear image of her upon the stage, her hands held high in the clasp of her fellow cast members as they took their final bow, her eyes bright and shining, her smile wide and triumphantly joyous. He jerked the cloth back over those still, blood-stained features and turned away, his gaze narrowing as he took in the layout of the old church, the aisled nave and wide transepts, the choir and broad apse.
"This Mr. Cummings, does he say he came back here to the Lady Chapel before locking up last night?"
Maitland shook his head.
"The sexton says he glanced back here from the retrochoir and gave a loud halloo, warning that he was about to lock up. But he didn't actually venture into the chapel itself, sir. And he wouldn't have seen her from the retrochoir. I checked myself."
Lovejoy nodded. In the damp coolness of the church, some of the pools of blood had yet to dry. Glossy and thick, they shimmered darkly in the lamplight, and he took care to avoid stepping in them as he walked slowly about the chapel. There'd been so many big, careless feet tramping in and out of the chapel in the past 6 hours that it would be impossible to accurately reconstruct what the floor had looked like before the sexton's arrival. But it seemed somehow disrespectful, a violation of that poor girl lying there against the wall, to be tromping heedlessly through what had once been her life's blood. So Lovejoy tried to avoid it. He stopped in front of the small altar's white marble steps. The blood was thickest here, where she'd been found. A lantern lay on its side, its glass shattered. He twisted around to glance back at his constable.
"Any idea who was the last person to use the Lady Chapel?"
Once again Maitland thumbed through his notebook.
It was all for effect, Lovejoy knew.
Edward Maitland could recite the entire contents of his notebook from memory, but he thought it gave weight to his pronouncements to be seen looking up each fact or figure.
"We're still checking," he said with a slowness that was again for effect. "But it was probably a Mrs. William Knackery. She's a haberdasher's widow. Comes to the Lady Chapel here every evening at about 4:30 and prays for some 20 to 30 minutes. She says the church was empty when she left, just before 5.
Lovejoy lifted his gaze to the blood-spattered walls, his lips tightening into a smile that had nothing to do with humour.
"It appears to be a fairly safe assumption to say she was killed here."
Warily, Maitland cleared his throat. He always grew uncomfortable when Lovejoy began stating the obvious.
"I should think so, sir. Which seems to place our murder between the hours of 5 and 8 last night." "That's the way we figured it, sir."
The constable cleared his throat again.
"We found her reticule some 2 or 3 feet from the body. It was open, so most of the contents had spilled out. But her pocketbook was still there, undisturbed, and that's a fine gold necklace and earrings she's wearing. In other words, no robbery." "No, sir." "But you say the reticule was open. I wonder if it simply fell open when she dropped it, or if our killer was searching for something.
Lovejoy glanced again around the cold chapel, felt the damp chill of the stones seeping up through the soles of his boots. He shoved his gloved hands deep into the pockets of his greatcoat and wished he hadn't forgotten his scarf.
I'm waiting, Constable.
The plains of Edward Maitland's broad, handsome face pinched with puzzlement.
Sir? For you to tell me why you felt it necessary that I come here myself.
The frown eased into a self-satisfied smile.
Because we figured out who did it, sir.
Really?
It was this what told us where to look.
Maitland took a small flintlock pistol from his pocket and held it out.
There's no doubt it was dropped by our murderer. One of the lads found it mixed up in the folds of her cloak.
Lovejoy took the weapon and balanced it thoughtfully in his hand. It was an exquisite piece of high-grade steel with a polished mahogany grip and a brass trigger guard intricately worked with the design of a serpent wrapped around a sword.
44 caliber, he decided, from the looks of it, with a rifled bore and a plate that read, W. Riddell, London. There was still enough blood on the barrel to leave a dark smudge across the palm of his kid glove. You'll notice the trigger guard, sir? The serpent and the sword?
Lovejoy ran the thumb of his left hand across the stain.
Yes, I did notice it, Constable. It's the device of Viscount Devlin, sir.
Lovejoy's grip tightened on the pistol in an involuntary convulsive movement. There were few in London who hadn't heard of Sebastian Viscount Devlin, or of his father, Lord Hendon, Chancellor of the Exchequer and trusted confidant of the poor old Mad King's Tory Prime Minister, Spencer Percival. Lovejoy flipped the pistol around to hold it out, butt first to his constable.
Careful, Constable. We're treading on dangerous ground here. It won't do to go leaping to any hasty conclusions.
Maitland met his gaze steadily. He made no move to take the pistol from Lovejoy's grasp.
There's more, sir.
Lovejoy dropped the pistol into his own greatcoat pocket.
Let me hear it. We've spoken to Rachel York's maid, a woman by the name of Mary Grant.
This time Maitland made no pretence of needing to consult his notes.
According to Mary, her mistress went out late yesterday to meet St. Cyr. She told the maid, and I quote, "His lordship will pay handsomely, never you fear."
The constable paused, as if to allow sufficient time for the effect of his words to penetrate, then added,
"It was the last anyone saw of her."
Lovejoy held his constable's light blue eyes in a steady stare.
What are you suggesting? That she was blackmailing the Viscount? Or threatening him in some way? Yes, sir. I take it you've checked into Viscount Devlin's whereabouts last night? Yes, sir. His servants say he left the house at about 5. Claimed he was on his way to his club. But according to his friends, Devlin didn't arrive at Watier's till just after 9. And where does the Viscount say he was? We haven't been able to locate the Viscount himself, sir. His bed was never slept in last night. Word about town is that he was set to fight a duel this morning.
Lovejoy brought one cupped hand to his mouth and blew thoughtfully against his palm and fingers before letting the hand fall again.
Whoever did this must have been drenched in blood. If Devlin is our man, he would have needed to return home for a change of clothes and a wash before going on to his club. It had occurred to me, sir. So, what do Devlin's servants have to say about that? Unfortunately, before he went out, Devlin gave his entire staff the night off. His lordship seems to be a most generous employer.
There was something about the way it was said, a clipping of the vowels, a tightening of the lips, that betrayed a hint of an emotion Maitland generally kept discreetly hidden. He was no radical, Maitland. He believed in the social order, in the great chain of being,
and the hierarchy of man. But that didn't stop him from craving wealth and position and envying those, such as Devlin, who'd been born to what Maitland himself couldn't even aspire. Lovejoy turned away to wander about the small lady chapel. His valet would know if a set of evening clothes had disappeared from his lordship's wardrobe. His lordship's man claims to have found nothing missing. But you know what these manservants can be like. Loyal to a fault. Lovejoy nodded absently, his attention caught by an enormous painting of the Virgin ascending into heaven that hung high above the altar. He himself had evangelical, reformist tendencies. A dangerous inclination he was careful to keep private, of course. He didn't hold with stained glass and incense and smoke-darkened Renaissance canvases in heavy gilded frames, considered them sinful popish remnants that had nothing to do with the austere God Lovejoy worshipped. But he noticed that blood from Rachel York's repeatedly slashed throat had sprayed across the painted Virgin's bare foot in such a way that it echoed, hauntingly, other images he had seen of Christ on his cross, blood trickling from the wounds in his impaled insteps. And he wondered again what the woman had been doing here, in this half-forgotten, inconsequential old church. It seemed a strange sight for a beautiful young actress to select for an assignation, or for blackmail. Maitland cleared his throat. I'm to tell you Lord Jarvis is wishful of seeing you, sir, at Carlton House, as soon as you finished here. The phrasing was deliberately delicate, and Lovejoy knew it, for this was a summons no magistrate could refuse. All the public offices, whether at Bow Street or Queen Square, Lambeth Street or Hatton Garden, had standing orders to report to Lord Jarvis immediately if it appeared a crime might involve some sensitive person, such as the mistress of a royal duke, or the brother of a peer of the realm, or the only son and heir of a powerful cabinet minister. Lovejoy sighed. He'd never exactly understood the precise nature of Lord Jarvis's influence. In addition to a mammoth townhouse on Berkeley Square, the man kept offices in both St. James's Palace and Carlton House, although he held no government portfolio. And while it was true that he was tied by blood to the royal family, the relationship was that of cousin only. It had often seemed to Lovejoy that Jarvis's position could best be described by that vague medieval phrase, the power behind the throne. Although how Jarvis had acquired that power, and how he had maintained it through the course of King George's long descent into madness, Lovejoy could never understand. He only knew that the Prince of Wales now depended on the man as much as the king ever had, and that when Jarvis summoned a magistrate, the magistrate went. Lovejoy swung back to his constable. You've already sent him word of this? I thought he'd want to know right away, Devlin's father, being so close to the Prime Minister and all. Lovejoy blew out a long, tense breath that turned into a frosty mist in the cold air. You do realise the delicacy of the situation? Yes, sir. Lovejoy's gaze narrowed as he studied the constable's impassive face. Odd that it had never occurred to Lovejoy to wonder until now about Edward Maitland's politics. But then it had never really mattered until now. Lovejoy tried to tell himself it still didn't matter, that their job began and ended with the need to investigate and solve this murder, and punish the malefactor. And yet, the Earl of Hendon, like Spencer Perceval and the other ministers in the King's cabinet, was a Tory, whereas the Prince of Wales and the men with whom he surrounded himself were Whigs. At any time for the son and heir of a prominent Tory to be accused of such a crime would have been explosive. For the accusation to come now, when the old king was about to be declared mad and the prince made regent, could have profoundly far-reaching implications, not just for the composition of the government, but for the nature of the monarchy itself. Chapter 4. The privileged inhabitants of fashionable London were just leaving their beds when Sebastian climbed the short flight of steps to his Brook Street home. Only the distant fog-muffled rumble of traffic from New Bond Street and the squeals of children playing chasey in the charge of nursemaids in nearby Hanover Square disturbed the noonday silence. There was a kind of sweet oblivion in exhaustion, a blessed numbness, and Sebastian felt it now. Murray, his majordomo, met him in the hall, an unusually anxious look drawing the man's features together into a frown. "My lord," he began. Sebastian's gaze fell on a familiar cane and top hat resting on the hall table. He was suddenly intensely aware of his crumpled cravat, and the blood-encrusted graze across the side of his forehead, and the inevitable toll taken by all the brandy-tinged hours that had passed since last he'd slept. "I take it my father's here?" "Yes, my lord. The Earl awaits you in the library, but I believe it imperative that you first be made aware of an incident which occurred this morning." "Later," said Sebastian, and crossed the hall to open the library door. Alistair Sincere, the 5th Earl of Hendon, sat in a leather armchair near the fire, a glass of Sebastian's brandy cradled in the hand that rested on one knee. At his son's entrance, the Earl looked up, his jaw working back and forth, as it had a tendency to do when his emotions were aroused. At 65, he was still a powerful man, with a barrel chest and a thick shock of white hair above a heavily featured face. He had the most startling, deep blue eyes Sebastian had ever seen. For as long as he could remember, Sebastian had watched those brilliant eyes flare with an emotion he could never quite identify each time Hendon's gaze came to rest upon his only surviving son. And for the past 15 years or more, Sebastian had watched that blaze of emotion quickly disappear beneath a tide of pain and disappointment that was all too easy to read. "So," said the Earl now, "did you kill him?" "Talbot?" Sebastian swung off his caped driving coat and tossed it over one of the cane chairs by the bowed front window. His hat and gloves followed. "Unfortunately, no." "You're damned cool about it." Sebastian walked to the side table and poured himself a glass of brandy. "You would wish me otherwise?" The Earl's jaw worked furiously back and forth. "What I wish is that you curb this propensity to try to put a period to the existence of your fellow men. This makes 3 meetings in the 6 months you've been back in England." "Actually, it's been some 10 months since I sold out." "Damn your impertinence!" Hendon surged to his feet. "The last one. What was his name?" "Danford." "That's right. Danford I could understand. There are some insults a gentleman can't be expected to allow to pass unchallenged. But Talbot! My God, you were screwing the man's wife. There'd have been hell to pay if you'd killed him, I can tell you that." Sebastian drained his brandy in one long pull and tried to swallow 28 years' worth of raw, conflicting emotions with it. He hadn't, in point of fact, been screwing Melanie Talbot. But even if Sebastian had been inclined to explain himself, there would have been no point. The idea of simple friendship between a man and a woman was something Hendon could neither believe nor understand, any more than he'd understand why Sebastian would care if a man such as Captain John Talbot should choose to beat his gentle young wife. "The man wants killing," Sebastian said simply. "Why, so you can have his wife?" Turning away, Sebastian went to splash himself another drink. "That was never my intention." "What you need is a wife of your own." Sebastian froze, then carefully lowered the brandy carafe. "So we're back to that, are we?" "If you're going to insist upon continuing this dissolute lifestyle of yours, the least you can do is have the courtesy to ensure the succession before you drink yourself into a decline. Or go out some morning and get yourself shot." "You underestimate me." He turned to find his father studying the gash across Sebastian's forehead through narrowed, troubled eyes.
This one was close. I told you, the man wants killing.
The Earl's jaw hardened.
You're 28. It's past time you settled down.
To do what?
Take over management of the estates.
Sebastian laughed at the spasm of alarm that crossed his father's features, lifted the brandy in a mock toast, and murmured, "Touché."
The seat for Upper Walford is empty.
Sebastian choked on his drink.
You can't be serious.
His father continued to stare at him. Sebastian lowered his glass.
Good God, you are serious. Why not? It would give you something to do besides drinking and gaming and sleeping with other men's wives. And we could use a man of your abilities in the Commons.
Sebastian subjected his father to a long study.
Afraid Prinny means to bring in the Whigs if he's made regent, are you? Oh, the Prince of Wales will be made regent, make no mistake about that. It's only a question now of form and timing. But he'll find he runs up against stiff opposition if he attempts to circumvent the Tories and resurrect the Ministry of All Talents. Or something worse.
Not so stiff as you might wish, obviously, if you're trying to recruit me as a candidate. The Earl lowered his gaze to his own glass, turning it slowly in his palm so that the cut facets reflected the light from the lamps that burned even now at midday against the foggy gloom.
One might consider it a duty, in such perilous times as these, to join right-thinking men in defence of national interest, property and privilege.
I don't suppose it's ever occurred to you that if I were in Parliament I might actually choose to challenge the sacred traditions of property and privilege, and champion instead the heresies of Jacobinism, atheism and democracy. Lord Hendon swallowed the remainder of his brandy in one long gulp and set the glass aside.
Even you wouldn't be such a fool.
Without bothering to ring for the footman, he strode to the door, only pausing with his hand on the knob to glance back and say,
"Think about it."
Sebastian stood at the window, one hand holding aside the heavy green velvet as he watched his father's powerful, familiar figure disappear into the swirling fog. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or an effect of the mists, but his father suddenly looked older and more tired than Sebastian remembered him being, and he knew a twist of regret, an urge to reach out and stop his father, to somehow make things right between them, except that things could never really be right between them because Sebastian could never be what his father wanted him to be, and they both knew it. He was reminded again of that long-ago, laughter-filled morning on the slopes above the cove. Alistair St. Cyr hadn't been there that summer. Even in those days the Earl had spent most of his time in London. But he'd come home the next day, his face tight with grief, to hold the pale, lifeless body of his eldest son and heir clutched in his arms. With Richard dead, the title of Viscount Devlin, like the position of heir apparent, had passed to the second son, Cecil. Only Cecil had died, too, just 4 years later. Then all of Alistair St. Cyr's hopes, all his ambitions and dreams had fallen on the boy who'd never been meant to be the heir, the youngest, and least like his father of them all. With a shrug, Sebastian let the curtain drop and turned toward the stairs. He'd made it almost to his bedroom when his major domo came hurrying down the hall.
"My lord, I must speak with you. We've had the constables here this morning."
"Not now, Maury."
"But, my lord—"
"Later," said Sebastian, and firmly shut the door. Chapter 5. His hat clutched in his cold hands, Sir Henry Lovejoy followed a liveried and powdered footman through the echoing, labyrinth-like corridors of Carlton House. A few months ago Lord Jarvis would have held such an audience at St. James's Palace, where the poor mad old King George III kept his offices. That Jarvis had now shifted his base here to the palace of the Prince of Wales struck Lovejoy as the clearest sign imaginable that a regency was indeed imminent. The great man was at his desk, writing, when Lovejoy was ushered into his presence. He acknowledged Lovejoy's existence with a curt motion of one plump, ringed hand, but he didn't glance up or even invite Henry to sit. Henry hesitated just inside the threshold, then went to stand before the hearth. The fire was a small one, the room cavernously large and frigid. Henry held his numb hands out to the flames. From somewhere in the distance came the rhythmic rat-a-tat of a hammer and the clanging of what might be scaffolding. The Prince of Wales was always renovating, whether here at Carlton House or at his pavilion in Brighton. "Well," said Jarvis at last, laying aside his pen and shifting in his chair so that he might regard his visitor, "what have you to report about this sorry business?" Retracting his cold hands and turning, Lovejoy executed a neat bow, then launched into a precise description of the crime scene, the victim, and the evidence they'd collected so far. Yes, said Jarvis, thrusting up from his chair with an impatient gesture that cut Henry short. "I've heard all this from your constable. It's obvious Lord Devlin must be arrested immediately. Indeed, I can't conceive why a warrant hasn't been issued already." Lovejoy watched his lordship fumble in his pocket for a delicate ivory snuff-box. He was an unusually tall man, standing well over 6 feet in height and weighing some 20 to 25 stone. In his youth he had been handsome. Beneath the ravages of indulgence and dissipation and the passing of the years, traces of those good looks could still be seen, in their fiercely intelligent grey eyes, the strong aquiline thrust of the nose, the sensual curve of the mouth. Lovejoy cleared his throat. "Unfortunately, my lord, I'm not convinced the evidence is sufficient to justify such an action at this time." Jarvis's head came up, his eyes narrowing, his fleshy face deepening in hue as he fixed Lovejoy with a hard stare. "Not sufficient? Good God, man! What do you want, an eyewitness?" Lovejoy drew a steadying breath. "I admit the evidence implicating the Viscount appears on the surface quite damning, my lord, but we really know very little as yet about this woman. We don't even have a clear idea as to what the killer's motive might have been." Deftly flicking open his snuff-box with one fat finger, Lord Jarvis lifted a pinch to his nostrils and sniffed. "She was raped, was she not?" "Yes, my lord." "So there's your motive." "Perhaps, my lord, although the violence of the attack suggests a level of anger, of instability even, which goes beyond simple sexual hunger." Jarvis closed the box with a snap and sighed. "Unfortunately, such outbursts of violence are not unknown amongst young gentlemen who have served king and country in war. As I understand it, Devlin has killed on at least 2 other occasions since his return from the continent." "Affairs of honour, my lord." "And his opponents were wounded, not killed." "Nevertheless, the tendency is obviously there." His lordship walked away to stand for a moment at a window overlooking the terrace below, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile carefully composed as if in deep thought. It was a moment before he spoke. "You're a sophisticated man, Sir Henry. Surely I've no need to explain to you what it means to have the son of a prominent peer, a member of the government, for God's sake, implicated in such a crime. If we are seen to hesitate—" He swept one well-tailored arm in an expansive gesture toward the streets. "If the crowds out there believe that being born to a position of privilege is enough to allow an Englishman to get away with rape and murder, with sacrilege—" Jarvis broke off, his arm falling back to his side, his voice dropping to a deep, solemn hush. "I was in Paris, you know, in 1789. I'll never forget it. The sight of blood running in the gutters, of men's severed heads stuck on pikes, of gentlewomen snatched from their carriages and torn limb from limb by the howling mobs."
He paused, his gaze sharpening suddenly on Lovejoy's face.
"Is that what you want to see here, in London?"
"No, of course not, my lord," Lovejoy said hastily.
He knew he was being manipulated, knew there were undercurrents to all this that he, a simple magistrate, could never hope to understand. He knew it, yet that didn't stop the chill that touched his soul, the sick dread that clutched at his vitals. It was every Englishman's worst fear that the endless, rampant, mindless carnage of the French Revolution might some day spread across the Channel and destroy everything he held most dear. "If Lord Devlin is indeed innocent of this terrible crime," Jarvis was saying, "he will in due course be exonerated and freed. The important thing is to be seen acting now. These are perilous times in which we live, sir. The news from the war is not good. The masses are discontented and sullen, and easily stirred up by radicals. With His Majesty's health unlikely to improve, and a Regency Bill even now before Parliament, the very stability of the realm could be at stake. This is no time to be seen to hesitate, to dither and delay. The Prince of Wales wants Devlin arrested, and he wants it done before nightfall."
Jarvis paused.
"I trust I can rely upon you to handle the situation with the tact and discretion required."
It was never easy bringing a member of the aristocracy to justice. Yet it did happen. It wasn't so many years since the 4th Earl Ferrers had been arrested for the murder of his steward, tried before the House of Lords, and hanged. As heir to the Earl of Hendon, Sebastian St. Cyr carried the title of Viscount Devlin as a courtesy title only. Lord, he might be called. But otherwise, the title conveyed upon him none of the legal rights of an actual peerage. Until the day he became Earl of Hendon, in his father's stead, Devlin would not, technically, be a peer, and so he would be tried before the King's Bench, like any other common criminal, rather than in the House of Lords. If it came to that, of course. Lovejoy bowed sharply.
"Yes, my lord, I'll see to it personally."
An unexpectedly winning, almost gentle smile spread across Lord Jarvis's face.
"Good man. I knew I could count on you."
His hat gripped tightly before him, Lovejoy bowed himself out of the great man's presence. But as he turned to walk down that long, ornate corridor, his footsteps echoing hollowly, his heart feeling strangely heavy in his chest, Sir Henry Lovejoy became aware of a growing conviction that he was being used. Chapter 6. Sometimes dreams of the war still came to him. Dreams haunted by dying children, dark eyes filled with pain and fear and bewilderment, and golden-skinned women, swollen, pregnant bellies ripped open by soldiers' bayonets. Once it had mattered to him which soldiers' bayonets, French or English. It had mattered desperately. That had been before he'd understood it was irrelevant, and that it was only a factor of time and geography, that soldiers of all nations did these things. Once he'd thought England a nation anointed by God, a favoured land blessed and divinely protected, a force of good battling enemies who must therefore be the forces of evil. Once he had believed that there were such things as just wars and righteous causes. Once. Sebastian opened his eyes, his breath coming short and fast, his clenched hands clammy with sweat. The gloom of his velvet-shrouded bedchamber gave no indication of time, and it was a moment before he remembered where he was and why. He hadn't meant to sleep, had only intended to rest. Slowly he squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, but the memory of the images remained dark and haunting and indelible. Sir Henry Lovejoy decided to take Senior Constable Edward Maitland with him to Brook Street, along with another younger constable named Simplot, whom Maitland suggested. It wasn't that Lovejoy expected a man of Devlin's position in society to resist arrest, but Lovejoy had to admit to a certain secret fear that, minus the two constables' weighty presence, the Viscount might not take Lovejoy seriously. One heard tales of this Viscount, of his irreverent, unconventional ways. Lovejoy could imagine such a man simply laughing in the face of an arresting magistrate. Perhaps if Lovejoy had stood taller than 4'11" in his boots, he'd have felt more confident. At any rate, he was quietly pleased to discover that Simplot was even taller than Maitland and satisfyingly broad-shouldered. "Wait for us," Lovejoy told the driver of their hackney as they drew up before Devlin's Mayfair residence. The townhouse was an elegant structure with a neat bay window and beautifully proportioned Ionic portico, but it couldn't begin to compare with St. Cyr House, that massive granite pile on Grosvenor Square that would someday belong to Devlin, along with his father's titles, the estates in Cornwall and Devon and Lincolnshire, the interests in mining and shipping and banking. Lovejoy stared up at the townhouse's neat stuccoed facade and wondered what it said about relations between the Earl of Hendon and his only son and heir, that Devlin chose to reside here, in Brook Street, rather than beneath that palatial paternal roof. "His lordship will be finding the lodgings at Newgate a far cry from this," Maitland said in a quiet aside as a stony-faced majordomo bowed them into the hall. "A far cry indeed," he added, his handsome blonde head craning this way and that in an attempt to glimpse more of that gleaming expanse of black and white marble, the procession of gilt-framed paintings marching up the sweeping staircase that curved out of sight to the first floor. "You move ahead of the courts, constable," hissed Lovejoy, as the majordomo's discreet knock upon the library door elicited the Viscount's permission to enter. "My lord," said the majordomo, "the persons who were here to see you this morning have returned with another." Viscount Devlin stood with one buckskin-clad hip resting on the edge of his desk, a shade of annoyance crossing his finely chiselled features as he glanced up from the sheaf of papers he held in his hands. He was built long and lean, with dark hair and a high forehead across which something, or someone, had recently left a nasty gash. "Yes," he said. "What is it?" Lovejoy waited for the majordomo to withdraw, then executed a neat bow and said, "I am Sir Henry Lovejoy, Chief Magistrate at Queen Square. A warrant has been issued in your name, my lord, for the murder of Rachel Yorke." Lovejoy couldn't have said what sort of reaction he'd been expecting. A flush of guilt, perhaps, or a passionate protestation of innocence. At the very least, one might have anticipated expressions of shock and sorrow over the death of a beautiful woman Devlin must surely have admired. But the young man's face remained impassive, unmoved by any emotion except for a faint quiver of what looked very much like boredom. He set aside the papers. "What is this? Some sort of jest?" "No jest, my lord. You have been implicated both by evidence found at the scene of Miss Yorke's death and by the testimony of witnesses." The Viscount crossed his arms at his chest and shifted his weight so that he could thrust his long legs out in front of him. "Really? That's interesting. What evidence? And who are these witnesses?" Lovejoy returned the younger man's stare. He had uncanny eyes, as hard and yellow as a noonday sun. It was with effort that Lovejoy kept his voice steady. "I must ask you, first of all, if you can account for your whereabouts between the hours of 5 and 8 yesterday evening." The Viscount blinked. "I was out." "Out?" said Edward Maitland, his jaw thrust aggressively forward. "Out? Out where?" The Viscount swung his head to subject the senior constable to a long, cool stare. "Out. Walking." An angry flush darkened Maitland's cheeks. It had been a miscalculation after all, Lovejoy now realized, to bring the constables.
Maitland was far too pugnacious and aggressive, too abrasive and hot-headed, to deal well with a man of Devlin's ilk. Lovejoy cast his subordinate a warning look and said quietly, "You forget yourself, Constable." To Devlin he said, "Can anyone vouch for you, my lord?" The Viscount brought his gaze back to Lovejoy. They were inhuman, really, those eyes. Wild and feral, like something one might see gleaming out of the darkness of a wolf's den. "No." Lovejoy knew a flicker of disappointment. How much simpler it would have been for them all if the Viscount had spent those fatal hours dining with friends, or at a pugilistic match. "Then I fear I must request you to accompany us to Queen Square, my lord." Those disconcerting yellow eyes narrowed. "I wonder, am I allowed to send a servant to fetch a greatcoat and other foul-weather accoutrements? I understand it can be rather chilly this time of year in—" He swung to fix Edward Maitland with a bland, ironic gaze. "Newgate, didn't you say?" Lovejoy felt a quick shiver run up his spine. There was no way the Viscount could have heard the senior constable's whispered remark earlier in the hall. It was impossible. And yet Lovejoy remembered hearing tales, near legendary accounts he'd always dismissed, of this young man's disconcertingly acute eyesight and hearing, of lethal reflexes, and a cat-like ability to see in the dark. Invaluable abilities he'd exercised of such deadly effect against the French in the peninsula before he'd come home for reasons shrouded in rumour and innuendo. "You may, of course, fortify yourself against the cold with whatever vestments you require," Lovejoy said hastily. An unexpected gleam of amusement flared in those terrible yellow eyes, then died. "Thank you," said Viscount Devlin. And for the second time that day, Sir Henry Lovejoy was left with the perplexing impression that beneath the surface all was not precisely as it seemed. Chapter 7. A half-hour later, Sebastian paused at the top of his front steps, one hand resting lightly on the rail. The temperature was falling rapidly with the approach of evening, the fog thinning down to dirty wisps that hugged the pavement and curled around the unlit lampposts. He drew a cold, acrid breath of air deep into his lungs and let it out slowly. He wasn't particularly worried. His acquaintance with Rachel York had been both casual and decidedly non-carnal in nature. Whatever evidence might seem to implicate him in her death would surely be quickly discredited, even if he did have no intention of telling anyone where precisely he had been between the hours of 5 and 8 the previous evening. And yet, as he started down the steps, Sebastian felt an odd sense of heightened awareness, a prickle of premonition. He was acutely conscious of the slow, ponderous movements of the big young constable behind him, and the queer, high-pitched voice of the magistrate, Lovejoy, as he hesitated beside the open door of the waiting hackney and said something to the jarvey. The hackney was an old one, an ancient landau, with a low, rounded roof and sagging leather straps and a musty, stale odour. The senior constable, the one named Maitland, swung around suddenly to catch Sebastian's arm in a rough grip and lean in close. "I dare say it's quite a come-down from your usual mode of transportation," said Maitland, his lips pulled back in a smile, his eyes hard. "Isn't that right?" The man's smile widened enough to show his clenched teeth, his fingers digging in hard. "My lord." Sebastian met the constable's challenging blue stare with a tight smile of his own. "You'll wrinkle my coat," he said, one hand coming up to close around the constable's wrist. It was a simple manoeuvre he'd learned in the mountains of Portugal, a trick of pressure applied at precisely the proper points. The constable sucked in a painful breath, his hand losing its hold on the coat as he took an unwary step back. Days of stinking fog had left the stone steps slippery with a combination of coal soot and freezing condensation. One foot shooting off the edge of the first step, The constable spun around, his back slamming against the iron handrail as he scrambled to catch himself, missed, and went down on one knee on the second step. His top hat landed beside him. He had pretensions to dandyism, this constable, with his artfully tousled blonde curls and high shirt points and intricately arranged cravat. Clapping the hat back on his head, he straightened slowly, a dirty tear running down one leg of his expensive buff-coloured breeches. "Why, you bloody bastard!" Maitland's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring. But it was his hands Sebastian was watching. London constables didn't usually carry knives, although some of the more aggressive ones did. Maitland's knife was a small, wicked thing, with a honed blade that shone even in the faint light of a dull afternoon. The constable smiled. "Try something like that again and you won't live long enough to hang, my lord." It was all for bluster and effect, Sebastian knew that. But the younger constable, the one with the open face and big ox-like body, threw a quick, worried glance toward the street, where Lovejoy stood with his back turned and one foot on the hackney step. "Good God, Maitland, put that thing away before Sir Henry sees." He lurched forward, intending perhaps to shield the knife from the magistrate's view. But he was big and clumsy, the wet granite steps treacherous. His feet slid out from beneath him in turn. With a startled cry, he pitched forward, straight into Maitland's blade. Sebastian watched the young man's eyes widen with surprise, his face go slack. "Jesus Christ!" Maitland let go of the knife's hilt, his own features twisting with horror. The young constable wavered on his feet, his gaze caught by the knife still protruding from his chest. A thin trickle of blood spilled from his mouth. "You've killed me," he whispered, his gaze lifting to Maitland's, his legs buckling beneath him. Sebastian caught the young man as he fell. Blood spilled over Sebastian's hands, down the front of his greatcoat. Lowering the gasping constable to the footpath, Sebastian ripped off his own neckcloth, pressed it to the bubbling wound in the constable's chest. The fine linen turned red and sodden in his hand. "Good God!" whispered Maitland, staggering down the last step, his face ashen. "Get a doctor, quickly!" snapped Sebastian. Maitland stood with one arm wrapped around the area railing as if for support, his eyes wide and staring. "Bloody hell! Sir Henry, if you would—" Sebastian pivoted on one knee to find Lovejoy standing on the hackney's steps, his little face pinched with shock. "My lord," said the magistrate, "what have you done?" "What have I done?" said Sebastian. Still grasping the railing, Constable Maitland's wide-eyed gaze lifted from Simplot to the magistrate. "He stabbed him!" Maitland suddenly shouted. "He stabbed Simplot!" Sebastian stared down at the man in his arms. The cold, misty rain had begun to fall, bringing a dark sheen to the paving stones and dampening the greying face of the dying man. Sebastian had seen enough death, from Italy and the West Indies to Portugal, to recognize the signs when he saw them. The man would die, and Sebastian would be blamed for this death, just as he was already being blamed for the murder of a West End actress he had barely known. He had considered that a misunderstanding, an inconvenience simply dealt with. Not so simple now, he thought. Easing his hands from beneath the constable's shoulders, Sebastian rose to his feet. Brook Street, once empty, now resounded with the tramp of approaching footsteps as 2 Inns of Court volunteers, dressed in scarlet with yellow facings, white waistcoats and breeches and black gaiters, appeared round the corner from Davies Street. "You men!" shouted Sir Henry Lovejoy from the carriage's open doorway, one trembling hand extended to point damningly at Sebastian. "Seize that gentleman! Constable Maitland, snap out of it!" Shaking his head as if to clear it, Maitland pushed away from the railing in a clumsy rush. Sebastian stopped him with a right hook that caught the constable under the chin and sent him reeling back to slam against the stucco wall. The rain was falling harder now. Someone shouted. The footsteps broke into a run. Sebastian spun around. Calculating the distance to the hackney's box, he leapt, landing beside the startled Jarvey with a force that set the old landau rocking on its sagging straps. "Here," said the Jarvey, his bloodshot eyes opening wide in a gnarled, grey-whiskered face. "You ain't allowed up here with me." "Then I suggest you get down." Seizing the rein, Sebastian tweaked the whip from the man's slack grip and snapped the leather thong over the bay's ears. The ancient carriage jerked forward. "Holy hell!" gasped the jarvey, and dived for the footpath. Sebastian threw a quick glance behind him. The Inns of Court men had stopped to kneel beside the wounded constable, but Maitland was running in the carriage's wake, his arms and legs pumping, his face twisted with determination. "Stop that, Hackney! The man's a murderer!" "Shit," said Sebastian, and spanked the reins hard against the bay's flanks. Without checking at the corner, he swung onto New Bond Street, cutting between a wide-wheeled freight wagon and a high-wheeled gig driven by a fat man in a yellow coat. The yellow-coated man jerked on his reins, his chestnut rearing up. "You there!" Sebastian heard Maitland shout. Looking back, Sebastian saw the constable leap onto the gig's high seat. "Give me those reins." I say, bleated Yellowcoat. "Get down," snarled Maitland, bringing the snorting horse under control and pushing Yellowcoat off his perch. Up ahead, a crush of vehicles jammed the street. Sebastian collected his reins, his eyes narrowing against the steady downpour as he judged the distance between a stalled dowager's barouche and the donkey cart making its slow, ponderous way up the street. "My lord!" shouted Sir Henry Lovejoy, his rain-lashed head and half his upper body protruding from the landau's open window, his fist pounding against the ancient panels. "In the king's name, I demand you stop this carriage at once!" Bloody hell, thought Sebastian. He'd forgotten about the magistrate. "Keep your head in," he shouted, sparing Sir Henry one swift glance. "I said I demand you—" Sir Henry broke off, his eyes widening as Sebastian swung around the barouche, nipping in so close that one of the carriage's dangling lamps caught the brim of the magistrate's hat. "Good God!" said the magistrate, jerking his bald head back inside the hackney. Hauling on the reins, Sebastian brought the landau careening in a sharp left onto Maddox Street. Behind them the donkey brayed and kicked, upending its cart to spill a load of squawking, feather-ruffled chickens across the wet pavement. "Get that bloody donkey cart out of my way!" screamed Maitland, the gig at a standstill, the blousy chestnut snorting and tossing its head as the constable jabbed at the ribbons. The bays were stretched full out now. Sebastian gave them their heads, ploughing up Maddox Street past the dignified stone pile of St. George's. A gentle tolling of church bells cut through the crisp evening air. Fashionable ladies in gaily coloured gowns and gentlemen holding aloft umbrellas scattered before the charging hackney. "Stop this hackney!" shouted Lovejoy, banging his fist again as Sebastian swerved around the back of the church and onto Mill Street. "In the name of the king!" Sebastian threw a quick glance behind them, but the street was empty, except for a lamplighter and his boy. Sebastian swung back around just as the bays erupted into the rain-washed expanse of Conduit Street, and a big-boned black hack, ridden by a young lady struggling to bring her mount under control, reared up before them. He hauled on the reins, wrenching the bays sideways. The horses plunged, snorting, hooves striking sparks from the edge of the footpath. The joints of the old landau squealed. Wood snapped. The coach body crashed to the pavement, the box skewing sideways. "Devlin!" screamed Sir Henry, struggling to push open the hackney's door. "Shit," whispered Sebastian. Rain sluiced down his face. At some point he realized he'd lost his hat. Sliding off the box, he skidded on the wet paving blocks and dodged the young lady's groom as the man scrambled off his own mount to grab the bridle of his mistress's squealing, wide-eyed black. Well-mannered and patient, the groom's mount stood with its big-boned grey head down, its reins trailing loose in the swirling gutter. Snatching up the wet leather, Sebastian vaulted into the saddle. "Hey, you there! Stop!" The white-faced groom swung around, his hands full with his mistress's still skittish hack. "Stop! Horse thief!" Sebastian kneed the grey into a flat-out gallop that carried them down the rain-darkened street toward Covent Garden, and the shadowy underworld of St. Giles beyond. Chapter 8. Charles, Lord Jarvis, couldn't remember precisely when he'd become aware of the level of incredible stupidity that characterized the vast majority of his fellow beings. He supposed the realization must have come upon him gradually over the years, as he observed the behavior and thought processes of the housemaids and grooms, solicitors and physicians and country squires who populated his childhood world. But Jarvis knew exactly when he'd understood the strength of his own intellect and the power it gave him. He'd been 10 years old at the time, and suffering under one of that long line of tutors his mother had insisted on hiring to teach her dead husband's only son and heir, rather than expose his fragile health and her own position as the heir's mother to the potentially deadly rigours of Eton. Mr. Hammer, this particular vicar, had been called, and he'd considered himself quite a scholar. Only vulgar necessity had induced Mr. Hammer to accept such an inferior position as tutor to a young boy, and he lost no opportunity to impress upon his pupil the magnitude of Jarvis's relative ignorance and mental incompetence. And then, one day, he set for Jarvis what was intended to be an impossible task, a mathematical problem that had taken Hammer himself, as an undergraduate at Oxford, a month to decipher. Jarvis completed the assignment in 2 hours. Jarvis's success so enraged his tutor that the man soon found an excuse to punish the boy with a severe beating. But it had been worth it, because in that moment of sweet triumph, Jarvis had understood. He'd understood that most men, even those who were gently born and well-educated, had minds that limped and plodded and tied themselves into knots, and that his own ability to think clearly and quickly, to analyze and discern patterns, and to devise intricate strategies and solutions was not only rare, it was also potentially a very powerful tool. At first, he had expected things in London to be different, but it hadn't taken Jarvis long to learn that essentially the same degrees of imbecility and incompetence existed at the highest echelons of society and government as were to be found, say, at a meeting of the hounds in Middlesex. The man Jarvis was dealing with now, Lord Frederick Fairchild, was typical. He was a duke's son, Lord Frederick, but only a younger son, which meant he'd had to make his own way in life. He'd succeeded fairly well by his society's standards, although a stubborn adherence to Whiggish principles had limited his access to power under the old King George III. Now, with the Prince of Wales about to be named regent, Lord Frederick had expectations that his years of loyal adherence to Prinny were finally to be rewarded. He'd come here, to the chambers the Prince kept aside for Jarvis's use at Carlton House, in a rather transparent attempt to ferret out which position exactly would be his. That he had aspirations of perhaps even being named Prime Minister was an open secret known to everyone in London. "The representatives from the Lords and Commons are to have a conference next Tuesday," Lord Frederick was saying, his gentle grey eyes wide and watchful. "If a compromise on the wording can be reached, I see no reason the swearing-in of the Prince as regent should not take place on the 6th. He paused and looked at Jarvis expectantly. Despite his 70 years, he was still considered a handsome man, Lord Frederick, tall and broad-shouldered, with a trim waist and an enviable, thick, wavy mass of silver hair. A widower, he was quite a favourite with the ladies. He could always be counted on to squire an unescorted matron down to supper, or to solicitously turn the pages of her music when she played. His amiability and social skills kept him amply supplied with invitations to country house parties and the usual whirls of the London season. But Lord Frederick had expensive habits, dangerously expensive habits, which added a hint of urgency to his voice as he cleared his throat and asked with studied casualness,
Has the Prince made any decisions yet on the disposition of offices for the new government he'll be forming?
The question was delicately phrased. Everyone knew the Prince of Wales made few decisions on his own, outside such pressing matters as choosing the colour of the new silk hangings for his drawing rooms, or selecting an architect to undertake his latest renovation project. From his position near the window, Jarvis simply smiled. No, not yet. A spasm of disappointment, quickly veiled, passed over Lord Frederick's features. The man was atypically nervous today. He even jumped when one of Jarvis's secretaries knocked softly at the door and announced, "Sir Henry Lovejoy to see you, my lord. He says it's important." "Show him in," said Jarvis, very much aware of Lord Frederick's presence. It would be interesting to see if the man had heard of Rachel Yorke's death. Interesting, indeed. "Well, what is it?" Jarvis asked, his voice gravelly, with a deliberate show of impatience when the magistrate appeared. Sir Henry cast an inquiring glance toward Lord Frederick and hesitated. "You may speak frankly," said Jarvis, waving a vague hand in Lord Frederick's direction. "I assume this is about Lord Devlin." "Yes, my lord." The magistrate paused again, and something about his manner told Jarvis he wasn't going to like what he was about to hear. "He's escaped." Jarvis never allowed himself the luxury of losing his temper, although he did at times express anger for effect, to inspire fear, and to spur men on in their determination to please him. Now he allowed several calculated heartbeats to pass, then said, his tone icy with a nice mingling of incredulity and righteous indignation, "Escaped, Sir Henry. Did you say escaped?" "Yes, my lord. He stabbed one of my constables and stole a hackney carriage, which he then—" Jarvis pressed the thumb and index finger of one hand to the bridge of his nose and momentarily closed his eyes. "Spare me the details," Jarvis sighed, and let his hand fall. "I trust you've discovered Devlin's destination." A faint flush coloured the little man's cheeks. There was nothing like a subtle hint of incompetence to make a man feel, well, incompetent. "Not yet, my lord." From his seat near the fireplace, Lord Frederick rose to stare at them. "Do I understand you to say you've attempted to arrest the son of the Earl of Hendon? On what charges?" "Murder," said Jarvis blandly. "Murder? Good God, but I thought Talbot's wound more embarrassing than life-threatening. Has he indeed died?" It was Sir Henry who answered, with another of those bobbing little bows he affected. "Lord Devlin's most recent affair of honour was not, as I understand it, fatal. However, he has been implicated in the death of a young woman whose body was discovered this morning in St. Matthew of the Fields, near the Abbey. An actress by the name of Rachel Yorke." Jarvis watched with interest as Lord Frederick's jaw went slack. The man was usually better at maintaining his composure. "You've arrested Viscount Devlin for Rachel's murder?" Sir Henry blinked. "You knew her, my lord?" "I wouldn't say I knew her exactly. I mean, I've seen her, of course, at Covent Garden, and I'd heard she'd been killed, of course, but I hadn't no idea that Devlin—" Drawing a handkerchief from his pocket, Lord Frederick pressed the delicate linen to his lips. "Excuse me," he said, and hurried from the room. A faint frown deepening a line between his eyes, Sir Henry's gaze followed Lord Frederick's retreating figure. "I want every available man put on Devlin's capture," Jarvis said, recalling the magistrate's attention. Sir Henry bowed. "Yes, my lord." "You've sent to have the ports watched, of course?" Another bow. "Yes, my lord, although the Viscount wouldn't exactly be welcome on the continent these days." "There's always America." "Yes, my lord." The little man was beginning to bore him.
Jarvis reached for his snuff-box. "I trust I'll receive a more satisfactory report on this matter in the morning." "Let us hope, my lord," said Sir Henry Lovejoy, and bowed himself out. Yet after he left, Jarvis stood for a time at the rain-splattered window, his snuff-box held forgotten in his hand as he stared out at the darkness. The fog had finally cleared, so that from here he could see the Mall, its wet pavement shining in the flickering golden light thrown by the street lamps and the lanterns of the passing carriages. He hadn't cared before whether Devlin was responsible for the death of that actress or not. He still didn't care. All that mattered was that official inquiries into Rachel Yorke's murder be ended as quickly as possible, and that the young Viscount's notoriety be prevented from damaging the government at such a critical juncture. If necessary, the Viscount's father, the Earl of Hendon, could be eased out of the government. In fact, the more he considered it, the more Jarvis thought that some good might come of this tangle after all. While his staunch Tory sentiments made Hendon more palatable to Jarvis than a man of, say, Fairchild's stripe, the fact remained that Hendon had never been one of Jarvis's supporters. The old fool actually believed that politics could be conducted by the same rules of sportsmanship and fair play as a cricket match on the fields of Eton. If Jarvis could finally get rid of Hendon, managing the prince would be that much easier. Besides, Devlin's precipitous flight from justice and his presumably fatal attack upon an officer of the law certainly suggested an unexpected degree of guilt. The young man needed to be caught soon. Or killed. Jarvis flicked open his snuff-box, lifted a pinch to one nostril, and inhaled deeply. Yes, he rather thought it would be better if Devlin were killed. Chapter 9. The sounds of pursuit had long since faded into the distance. Sebastian slowed the grey to a walk. Darkness was falling fast, the rain easing to a fine mist as the wind rose. Turning up the collar of his greatcoat against the cold and the wet, Sebastian had time to regret the loss of his hat and consider his future course of action. Even here, away from the more fashionable neighbourhoods of Mayfair, heads swivelled to follow his passing and fingers pointed. Sebastian was acutely aware of his missing neckcloth, his mud-splattered boots, the bloodstains on his greatcoat and gloves. His immediate need, he decided, was to remove himself to an area in which his dishevelled appearance would occasion less remark. In the back alleys and byways of some place like Covent Garden or St. Giles, no one would look twice at a hatless man with a torn greatcoat and blood on his gloves. Beneath the folds of his greatcoat, Sebastian felt the weight of his pocketbook, and knew a moment of thankfulness for the forethought that had led him to slip the purse into his pocket before leaving the house. He would find an inn, he decided, someplace humble but warm and dry, and then he would set about contacting those who could— Sebastian's head came up. His attention caught by a faint sound, barely discernible above the racket of wooden wheels rattling over ruts, and the interminable patter of the rain. He was in a poorer quarter now, a neighbourhood of narrow streets with ageing houses and small shops, their dirty windows protected by iron grates. There were no fine carriages here. Only heavy, lumbering wagons and dog-carts winding their way through a growing throng of sturdy working folk, coopers and farriers, laundresses and piemen, their voices raised in a sing-song chorus of "Pies, rare hot pies." But he could hear it now, quite plainly, the steady thunder of hooves coming up fast, and a boy's voice shouting, "If you're looking for that rum cove on a grey, he went that way." "Bloody hell," whispered Sebastian, and urged his purloined mount forward into the night. He abandoned the grey in a warm stall on the edges of St. Giles. It was a notorious district, St. Giles, into which pursuing constables had been known simply to disappear forever.
London's authorities avoided it. The Black Hart Inn lay at the end of a mean little lane known as Pudding Row, in an area of crooked streets and rickety old medieval buildings that seemed to lean against one another for support, their upper floors jutting out over unpaved passages running foul with open gutters. A low, half-timbered relic, the inn had leaded front windows through which only a faint glow of light spilled out into the night. Sebastian paused in the shadow of the doorway, his head turning as he listened. The rain had stopped, but with the coming of darkness, the temperature had plummeted, sending most of London's residents scurrying indoors. He could hear the distant screech of iron-rimmed wheels and the dull monotony of a church bell sounding someone's death knell. And nothing more. Pushing open the door, he went inside. A heavy medley of smells washed over him, of ale and tobacco, of bitter coal smoke and hot grease, and rank, stale sweat. The common room was dark, the guttering dips casting only a dim light that flickered over walls and low-beamed ceilings blackened with age. Men in fustian and corduroy stood with elbows propped on the counter, or lounged about scarred tables and benches. They looked up as Sebastian entered, the roar of their talk and laughter ebbing, their sunken eyes suspicious, watchful. He was a stranger here, and strangers in such places were never welcome. Pushing his way to the counter, he bought a tankard of ale and ordered dinner. The bread would be adulterated with chalk and alum, the beef rancid and gristly, but he would find little better in this district, and he'd eaten nothing since the breakfast he'd shared that morning with Christopher at a public house not far from the Heath. There was a fire at one end of the room. Sebastian made his way toward it, his tankard in hand. The general swirl of noise had resumed, although he was aware of resentful eyes following him, of an air of tense wariness. Furtive shadows moved across the walls as 2 or 3 men sidled quietly from the room. Sebastian was halfway across the sawdust-covered floor, winding his way between packed, unwashed bodies, when a boy of perhaps 8 or 10 brushed against him. "A natty lad," said Sebastian, his voice dangerously cheerful as he deftly retrieved his purse from the boy's fist. The unexpected loss of his prize caused the young thief to hesitate, so that, dropping the purse into an inner pocket, Sebastian managed to collar the lad and haul him back around, all without setting down the tankard or spilling a drop of ale. But not a particularly skilled one, I'm afraid. Every eye in the room was trained upon them, and Sebastian knew it. Yet the atmosphere was more one of watchful expectation than of hostility. A market beadle from Covent Garden, a big ponderous man with a stained waistcoat and 3 chins, stood up from a nearby table to wipe the back of one meaty hand across his wet lips. "Aye, he's an Anabaptist, that one." A low ripple of laughter travelled around the room, for it was a name given to young pickpockets who'd been caught in the act, and subjected to the rough-and-ready punishment of being dumped in the nearest pond. "Want we should rechristen him?" The lad kept his chin firm and his gaze steady, but Sebastian felt a shudder travel up the boy's thin frame. For a homeless child, a dunking in a freezing pond on a night like this could mean death. "I've no doubt he could use the ablution," said Sebastian, his words greeted by more laughter, "but the boy's done no real harm." Opening his fist, Sebastian let the thin, ragged cloth of the urchin's shirt slide through his fingers. "Go on," he added, jerking his head toward the door when the boy hesitated. "Get out of here." Instead of running, the boy stood his ground, his dark, unexpectedly bright eyes travelling over Sebastian in open, thoughtful assessment. "On the lam, are you?" Sebastian paused with his tankard halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon?" The boy was older than Sebastian had first taken him to be, probably more like 10 or 12, and obviously observant enough to notice that beneath the mud and blood, Sebastian's greatcoat was exquisitely tailored, and of a fine cloth that had been new just hours ago.
"What you do? Lose all your blunt and bolt before they could shut you up in the Neverwag? Or did you kill a man in a duel?"
One small, bony hand reached out to finger the dark telltale stain on Sebastian's chest.
"Me? I think you killed somebody."
Sebastian took a long, deep swallow of his ale. "Don't be ridiculous."
"Ho! And why else would such a swell cove be stopping at a dive like the Black Art? You answer me that."
A prepubescent young girl with thin shoulders and a shank of straight, colourless hair appeared from the back rooms to dump the contents of her tray on the table in front of Sebastian. He stared at the small loaf of suspiciously white bread, the plate of unidentifiable meat awash in ladlefuls of congealing fat, and felt his appetite ebb.
"You should tuck that purse of yours somewhere out of sight and out of reach,"
said the urchin, as Sebastian seated himself at the table.
"You know that, don't you? It's like an open invitation, bulging out your coat all obvious like. In fact, it's criminal, I'd say, to be tempting honest lads into mischief like that."
Sebastian glanced up, his fork halted halfway to his mouth. "And when were you ever an honest lad?" The boy laughed out loud.
"I like you,"
he said, his gaze drifting to the plate of food before Sebastian. A quiver passed over his features, a spasm of desperate want quickly hidden.
"I tell you what, got a proposition for you, I do, if you're agreeable. I could hire myself out to you for, say, 10pence a day, show you the ropes of this part of town. I could be your general factotum. A fine gentleman like yourself shouldn't be without a servant."
"True." Sebastian chewed a mouthful, swallowed. "But I'm the strangest creature. I have a decided aversion to being fleeced by those in my employ."
The boy sniffed. "Well, if you're dead set on holding that against me," he said, his voice dripping reproach, his feet dragging as he turned away.
"Wait a minute."
The boy swung back around.
"Here." Picking up the hunk of bread, Sebastian tossed it to the boy, who caught the small loaf deftly with one hand. Sebastian grunted. "You're a better catch than a foist. Now, get going." Chapter 10. Cat Boleyn had first met Rachel York on the banks of the Thames on a snowy December night just over 3 years ago. Rachel had been 15 then, heartbreakingly young and full of despair. Cat had been all of 20, but already the toast of London's stage for several years, her own secrets and painful past hidden beneath fine jewels and practised smiles. And so it was to the Thames that Cat Boleyn went that Wednesday night, to toss a bunch of yellow roses from the centre of London Bridge, and watch, dry-eyed, as they drifted apart and slowly sank beneath the river's black waves. Then she turned purposefully away. The clouds still hung low over the city, but with the coming of night the rain had eased off into a fine mist. When she was a little girl, Cat had loved the mist. She lived in Dublin then, in a whitewashed house, facing an open green edged with chestnuts and giant oaks. One of the oaks, older than all the others, had great spreading branches that reached nearly down to the ground. Even before she started school, Cat's father had taught her to climb that tree. She'd always thought of him as her father, even though he wasn't. But he was the only father she'd ever known, and he encouraged her to do things that sometimes frightened her mother. "Life is full of scary things," he used to tell Cat. "The trick is not to let your fears get in the way of your living. Whatever else you do, Catherine, don't settle for a life half-lived." Cat had tried to tell herself that the day the English soldiers came. The mist had been thick that morning and heavy with the acrid scent of burning. She'd stood in the dim morning light and repeated her father's words to herself over and over again as they dragged her mother kicking and screaming from that pretty little white house. They'd made Kat watch what they did to her mother that day, and they'd made Kat's father watch too. And then they'd hanged them, side by side, Kat's mother and father both, from the oak at the edge of the green. Those days belonged to a different lifetime, to a different person. The woman who now drove her phaeton and pair at a smart clip through London's lamp-lit streets called herself Kat Boleyn, and she was one of the most acclaimed actresses of the London stage. The velvet pelisse she wore that evening was a bright cherry red, not a smoke-smudged grey, and she wore a string of pearls at her throat, rather than a black band of mourning. But she still hated the mist. Reining in before the townhouse of Monsieur Léon Pierpont, Kat handed the ribbons to her groom and stepped down easily from her high-perched seat. "Walk them, George." "Yes, miss." She paused on the footpath to stare up at the classical facade before her, lit softly by the gleam of flickering oil lamps. Like so much else about Leo Pierpont, this house on Half Moon Street was carefully calculated to create just the right impression. Large, but not too large, elegant, and with a touch of the faded grandeur to be expected from a proud nobleman now forced to live in exile. When one lived a life that was essentially a lie, appearances were everything. She found him alone in his dining room, just sitting down to a table laid for one with fine china and gleaming silver and the sparkle of old crystal. He was a slim, delicately built man, upon whom the passing years, however difficult they might have been, nevertheless seemed to have rested easily. His face was largely unlined, his light brown hair barely touched with grey. Kat had never known his precise age, but given that he'd been almost 30 when driven from Paris by the Reign of Terror, she knew he must be in his late 40s by now. "You shouldn't have come," Leo said, his attention seemingly all for his soup. Kat jerked off her gloves and tossed them with reticule, pelisse and hat onto a nearby chair. "Whose reputation are you afraid will be compromised, Leo? Mine or yours?" He glanced up, grey eyes gleaming with a faint smile. "Mine, of course. You have no reputation left to lose." He signalled for the servants to leave them, then sat back. The smile faded. "You've heard what happened to Rachel, I suppose?" Kat pressed her flattened palms against the tabletop and leaned into them. Beneath the silk bodice of her gown, her heart thudded hard and fast. But she managed to keep her voice calm, steady. "Did you do it?" If he had, he wouldn't admit it, Kat knew that. But she wanted to watch his face while he denied it. Leo dipped his spoon into his soup and brought it carefully to his lips. "Come now, ma petite. Even if I had wanted Rachel dead, do you seriously think I would have killed her in such a spectacular fashion? In a church? From what I understand, the walls were practically painted with her blood." Kat watched his long, slim hands reach for a piece of bread. "One of your minions could have got carried away." "I choose my minions more carefully than that." "So, who killed her?" A shadow touched the Frenchman's features, a brief ghost of concern that Kat almost believed might be genuine. "I wish I knew." Kat turned away, her quick, long-legged stride carrying her across the room and back again. Leo shifted his weight in his chair and watched her. "Ring for another glass," he said after a moment. "Have some wine?" "No, thank you." "Then at least stop pacing up and down the room in that fatiguing way. It's not good for my digestion." She hesitated beside the table, but she didn't sit. "Who was Rachel scheduled to meet last night?" Picking up a knife, Leo calmly spread his bread with butter. "No one that I'm aware of." "What would you have me believe then, Leo? That she went there to pray?" "It's what people generally do in church." "Not people like Rachel."
Kat went to stand before the hearth and stare unseeingly at the glowing coals. There was always danger in this game they played. They all knew that. But whoever had met Rachel last night was more than dangerous. He was evil, and what he'd done could threaten them all. They'll be looking into her death, the authorities, I mean. They could stumble across something. Careful, ma petite, said Leo, reaching for his glass. The walls have ears. He took a slow swallow of his wine, then frowned. But no, I don't think the authorities will learn anything that need concern us. I went past her lodgings this morning as soon as I heard what had happened, but the constables were there. I'll go back tonight and make certain she left nothing that could be incriminating. You could be too late. They might have found something already. Leo huffed a soft laugh. You can't be serious. This is London, not Paris. They're fools, these Englishmen. So afraid of the danger to their liberties posed by a standing army that they'd rather see their cities overrun with thieves and murderers than establish a proper police force. Those constables won't have found anything. Besides, he thrust another piece of bread in his mouth, chewed and swallowed. They think they already know who did it. Kat swung to face him. You said you didn't know who killed her. I don't know who killed her, but the London authorities think they do. He's doubtless under arrest even as we speak. Some vicomte with a reputed propensity for slaughtering his fellow men. He has a strange name, something like Diablo or Devil or... Devlin. Her breath coming uncharacteristically shallow and fast, Kat left the fireplace and walked up to Leo, her gaze searching his face. That's it. He gave her a wide-eyed look, and she knew he was playing with her, had recalled Sebastian's name all along. Ah, I remember now, he said, his head tipping to one side as he smiled up at her. Devlin was one of your protectors once. Is that not so? Before he went off to the wars to fight for king and country against the forces of evil and the Emperor Napoleon. It was a long time ago. Kat swung away and reached for her pelisse. She felt a sudden need to get away, to be alone. Pushing back his chair, Leo came to his feet in one smooth motion, his hand reaching out to close on her upper arm, stopping her, forcing her back around so he could look searchingly into her face. He was so languid, so slender and effete-looking, that one sometimes forgot both how swiftly he could move and what strength those long, thin fingers possessed. She stared blandly back at him, calling upon all her training as an actress to keep her features inscrutable, and willing the rapid, betraying beat of her heart to calm. But he knew her well, Leo. He knew her talents, and he knew, too, this one weakness she refused to admit, even to herself. A wry smile twitched one corner of his lips, then stilled. "When you're only 23, he whispered, his hand coming up to touch her cheek in a movement that was not quite a caress. Nothing in your life was so long ago. Chapter 11. Sebastian spent what was left of the night in a small chamber above the Black Hart's rear court. After one glance at the bed, he took off his boots, spread his greatcoat on a narrow wooden bench, and lay down upon it. He'd known worse in the war, watchful nights spent on a cold, stony ground, or listening to the scuttling of cockroaches across a dirt floor. He did not sleep. When dawn came, he rose from his makeshift bed and crossed to the window overlooking the rubbish-strewn yard below. The morning was raw and bitter cold, but he swung the casement open wide and drew the acrid air deep into his lungs, his thoughts on the events of the evening before. It had always seemed to Sebastian that such moments came in every man's life, pivotal instants when a chance occurrence or seemingly trifling decision could wrench a man away from what had appeared to be an inevitable future, and sent him hurtling in a different direction entirely. Yet it was difficult now to determine precisely when that moment in Sebastian's life had come, with his own flash of quick anger and the constable's misstep. Or had it come before that, the night before, with a promise given to a frantic, fearful woman? Sebastian pursed his lips and blew out a long sigh. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't regret that promise, nor could he betray the woman to whom it had been made. Drawing a small notebook from his pocket, he tore out a sheet of paper and scrawled quickly, "Please give Melanie my assurances that I shan't betray her. No matter what happens, she mustn't say anything to give herself away. Her life depends upon it. D." Folding the page once, twice, he wrote the name and address of Melanie's sister on the outside, then thrust the note deep into a pocket. He had calmly considered, during the long night, the options now open to him, and decided these came down to 3. He could surrender himself to Sir Henry Lovejoy at Queen Square, and place his faith in a system better known for delivering summary judgments than for ferreting out the truth. He could flee abroad, hoping someone might clear his name in his absence, but resigning himself to a life in exile if that failed to happen. Or he could lose himself in the shadows of the city and set to work discovering on his own who had killed Rachel York. She'd been an unusually attractive woman, Rachel. He'd seen her often at the city's various theatres, both on stage and at those select gatherings attended exclusively by such women and the wealthy, high-born men they sought to attract. He'd seen her, and, he had to admit, admired her. But he'd never taken her as his mistress, never even sampled what she had on several occasions, made more than obvious she was willing to give. He couldn't begin to fathom why or how he had come to be named as her murderer, yet he could place no reliance on the authorities bothering to discover the truth behind what had happened. When a city's detectives were paid a £40 reward for each conviction, true justice was more often than not a victim of avarice. And so at some point during the long night, Sebastian had decided that he would not escape abroad, nor would he surrender himself, trusting, foolishly, to the dubious expedients of British justice. Out there, somewhere, was the man who had killed Rachel York. Sebastian's only hope lay in discovering precisely who that killer was. 5 years in army intelligence had taught Sebastian that the first thing he needed was information. He needed to talk to someone who'd known Rachel, someone who could identify her enemies, someone who might know why she had gone on a cold winter's night alone to meet her death in a small, out-of-the-way Westminster church. He'd already decided against making any attempt to contact either his own family or friends. They would undoubtedly be watched, and he could do nothing that might endanger them. But no one would think to set a watch upon the actress who'd been playing Rosalind to Rachel's Celia in the Covent Garden production of As You Like It. The woman who'd broken Sebastian's heart 6 long years ago. The sun was rising higher in the sky, but only a faint hint of lightness showed through the inevitable mantle of dirty fog. He could hear the rumble of wagons and market carts on their way to Covent Garden, and the whirl of a knife-grinder's wheel in the yard below. And, nearer at hand, the sound of quick footsteps in the corridor outside his room. Flattening himself against the wall beside the door, Sebastian stood tense, waiting. Then he heard a furtive scratching, and a boy's whisper. "Oi, Governor, 'tis me, Tom." It was the urchin from last night. "Tom," said Sebastian, with malicious amusement. "I don't believe I'm acquainted with a Tom." From the far side of the panel came an impatient oath. "The figure what tried to prig your purse last night." "Ah, and you expect me to open the door to you, do you, my larcenous friend?" "Lord love you, Governor, now's no time to be funning. There's Bow Street men downstairs right this very minute. Asking for you, they are. Leastways, if you're the cove what knifed a constable over Mayfair way, and—" Sebastian opened the door so fast that Tom, who'd been leaning against it, half fell into the room. In the pale light, the boy looked thinner and dirtier than Sebastian remembered him. He fixed Sebastian with dark, assessing eyes. "They also say you cut up some mort in a church off Great Peter Street." There was a pause. "Did you?" Sebastian met the boy's hard gaze. "No." Tom nodded his head in quick, silent affirmation. "Thought I smelled a rum 'un, but there's 2 beaks in the common room right this very minute asking about you, and another 40-pounder out the front." Perching on the edge of the bench, Sebastian pulled on first one boot, then the other. "I take it you're suggesting I might find it advisable to depart through the window." "Aye, governor, and pretty soon too if you're not anxious to dance the Newgate hornpipe." Sweeping up his greatcoat, Sebastian crossed to the open window and surveyed the yard below. The casement opened above a low, lean-to roof of what he thought might be the kitchen, but the only exit from the yard was through the front arch. He would have to make his way along the slant of the lean-to roof, to where it abutted a jutting brick extension of the inn's 2nd story, and somehow climb from there up onto the main roof. "Why precisely did you come to warn me?" Sebastian asked, pausing with one leg over the windowsill to look back at the boy. "Caw, if ever a cove needed help, it's you, governor." Your altruism, while inspiring, is somehow less than convincing," Sebastian said, and dropped to the sloping roof below. Light and agile as a cat, Tom landed beside him. "I don't know what you means by that exactly, but my offer still stands. For $1 shilling a day, I'm your man. I know these parts very well, I do. If you're set on hiding out around here, you couldn't find a better snapper." "I thought the price was 10 pence, Sebastian said, running along the lean-to roof in a low crouch. "It was. Only, now I know the China Street pigs is after you, the price has gone up." Sebastian laughed, just as a shout went up from the yard below. Chapter 12. Sebastian cast a swift glance toward the yard where a burly, black-bearded man in a voluminous greatcoat stood with his head tipped back and one extended finger pointing damningly toward the roof. "Look, that's him for sure. Stop, I say! Stop in the king's name!" "Bloody hell," swore Sebastian. Straightening, he sprinted across the slope of the lean-to, the leather soles of his boots sliding dangerously on the wet slates, the boy 2 paces behind him. At the intersection of the kitchen roof and the brick wall of the inn's L-shaped wing, Sebastian swung around. "Here," he said, reaching down to bracket Tom's slim, bony frame with his hands, and lift the boy high. "Grab the edge of the roof and pull yourself up." Tom's bare, cold-numbed fingers fumbled for a hold, found one. "How are you going to get up?" he panted, heaving his legs up in a grunting rush that rolled him onto his stomach, then his back. The brickwork of the wall was uneven, offering a handhold here, a foothold there. Sebastian scrambled up beside the boy and held out a hand to help Tom to his feet. "Caw!" Tom let out his breath in a rush of wide-eyed admiration. "You'd make a first-rate second-story dancer, you would." Sebastian laughed, his gaze narrowing as he surveyed the tumble-down roofscape spread out around them. A freezing rain had begun to fall, mist-fine and bone-chilling. Blackbeard had disappeared from the courtyard. They could hear more shouts and the muffled sound of running feet on uncarpeted stairs. Sebastian glanced down at the boy beside him. In coming to warn Sebastian, Tom had placed himself squarely on the wrong side of the law. Sebastian nodded toward the span of 3 or 4 feet separating the Black Hart's rain-slicked roof from the crumbling tenement beside it. "Can you jump that?" To Sebastian's surprise, the boy's dirty face split into a toothy grin. "Aye, you just watch." His fists clenched with determination,
Tom took off at a dead run toward the edge of the roof, launching at only the last possible instant into a leap that carried him easily across the gaping distance. He landed lightly, his body wavering, his feet slipping only for a moment before he caught his balance on the steep, wet tiles. "I think you must have some training as a second-story dancer yourself," said Sebastian, springing after him. Tom crowed with delight. Together they crossed from one sagging rooftop to the next, skirting crumbling chimney pots and dodging broken eaves, their breath little puffs of steam in the cold air. At the end of the block, they found a drainpipe festooned with a tangle of bare, wet wisteria branches down which they slithered. They were off and running before the first of the Bow Street men, wheezing and swearing, had emerged onto the Black Hart's mossy roof. An early morning crowd of market women and milkmaids, piemen and butchers' boys filled the narrow lanes. Rounding the corner onto Great Leicester Street, Tom and Sebastian slowed to a walk, heading towards Charing Cross. "Where are we going now?" asked Tom, skipping a little to keep up with Sebastian's long-legged stride. Sebastian hesitated, then drew from his pocket the folded note he'd written to Melanie's sister that morning. "I have a message I'd like you to deliver to a lady. Cecilia Wainwright in Berkeley Square." Reaching for his purse, Sebastian counted out a handful of coins. "Here's a shilling for the letter, and a week's wages besides." There was no way to guarantee that the boy would actually deliver the message, of course. It was a chance Sebastian was going to have to take. Tom's unsmiling gaze dropped to the money in Sebastian's hand, then lifted. He made no move to take the coins. "You giving me the heave-ho?" Sebastian met the boy's dark, inscrutable gaze. "I don't think you understand. Continued association with me could very well get you hanged." "Nah," said Tom with a negligent sniff. "Transported, more like. I'm scrawny enough I could let on I'm only 9, and they'd believe me. They don't send little uns to the nubbin cheat." His face darkened, as if clouded by a sudden unpleasant memory. "This way's not usually." "You've a fancy to visit Botany Bay, do you?" Tom shrugged. "It's where they sent me mum." It was probably the complete lack of emotion in the boy's voice that got to Sebastian more than anything else. He blew out a long, slow breath. It was an ugly practice, this business of transporting mothers and leaving their children behind to starve on the streets of London. Sebastian held out the money. "Take it." For an instant longer, the boy wavered, his jaw held tight. Then he took the coins and slipped the letter inside his shirt. "Where you off to?" "There's someone I need to see." Tom nodded and turned without another word, his feet dragging, his head bowed. But at the corner he paused, his head lifting as he swung back around. "What's her name, then? This lady what you're all so fired anxious to meet?" Sebastian huffed a low, startled laugh. "What makes you think it's a lady?" Tom grinned. "I saw it, in your face. She must be a rare looker." He paused, his head tilting sideways. "So, what's her name?" Sebastian hesitated, then shrugged. "Cat. Her name is Cat." "Cat? That's no name for a lady." "I never said she was a lady." Chapter 13. Lord Stoneleigh slept face down in her bed, his eyes closed, his breathing heavy and even. At some point during the night he'd shoved down the fine linen of her bed covers in a fit of restlessness. Cat Boleyn propped herself up on her elbow and let her gaze travel over the broad, naked back and tight buttocks of the man beside her. He'd be a handsome man, if it weren't for that hint of weakness about the chin. They weren't usually so young, the men she took to her bed. Cat rested her cheek on one palm. She'd been playing the part of this man's mistress for 4 months now. At first she'd found his youthful ardour and the presence he showered upon her mildly diverting, but he was beginning to bore her. And with the prince soon to be made regent, staunch Tories such as Stoneleigh wouldn't be of much use any longer. She was considering setting her sights on Samuel Whitbread, widely expected to be given an important portfolio once the passage of the Regency Bill allowed the prince to form a new Whig government. Yawning softly, Cat slid from Stoneleigh's side. At least the older ones rarely stayed the night. She didn't like it when they stayed. Now she'd have to play the part of the lover again when he awoke, at least until she could get him out of the house. Morning performances were not her best. She slipped her bare arms into a silk wrapper and cast another glance at the tousled blonde head on her pillow. She supposed he thought he had the right, since he paid the rent on the house. What he didn't know was that the agent to whom he sent the rent money every month actually worked for Cat. In the past 5 years she'd managed to buy up the mortgage, not only on this house, but on 3 other such properties. Men were such fools, especially the ones with proud old family names and old money. Quietly letting herself out of the bedroom, she padded down the stairs. The drawing-room was dim, the fire on the hearth unlit, the peach-coloured satin drapes still drawn at the windows. The upper housemaid, Gwen, had obviously expected her mistress to sleep until noon or later. Cat went to throw open the heavy drapes and heard a voice from out of the past say, "You're awake early." She spun about, one hand flying up ridiculously to clutch together the gaping neck of her wrap, as if her naked body hadn't once been as familiar to this man as his was to her, as if he hadn't touched every inch of her with his lips and his tongue and his incredibly gentle, clever hands. Sebastian St. Cyr, Viscount Devlin, stood beside the empty hearth, one shoulder propped against the mantel, a boot heel hooked over the cold grate. He'd taken off his greatcoat and thrown it onto the back of a nearby chair. In the misty light of another dreary winter morning, he looked unkempt and dissolute and dangerous. A day's growth of beard shadowed his cheeks, and he had a nasty gash across one side of his forehead. She'd seen him, of course, in the 10 or so months since he'd been back in England, seen him in the crowd at the theatre, and once in New Bond Street, but always from a distance. They'd both been careful to keep a distance between them. "How did you get in?" He pushed away from the mantel and came at her, the lines bracketing his unsmiling lips deepening, although not with amusement. Cynical lines that hadn't been there before. "You don't ask why I'm here." Once he'd been her heart, her soul, her reason for living. Once she'd have given up anything for him. Anything. But that was 6 years ago, and she was as different from that love-obsessed young girl as she was from the laughing child who'd once climbed an oak tree on the edge of a sun-filled Irish green. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the shadow of his day's growth of beard, and the exhaustion that pulled his features taut. Close, but not too close. Still, it seemed, there was to be a distance kept between them. "Do you need money?" she asked, "or simply an introduction to a trustworthy band of smugglers who aren't particular about the identity of the passengers they carry across the channel?" He shook his head. "Do you really think I would run?" No, he wouldn't run. She might not know all that had happened to this man during those brutal years he was away, but she still knew this about him. He appeared to have slept in his clothes. His cravat was gone, and what looked like dried blood stained the white cuffs of his shirt. "You look terrible," she said. The Sebastian she'd known once would have laughed at that. He didn't. His gaze sought hers, captured it. "Tell me about Rachel York." His eyes were as frighteningly animalistic as she had remembered. She swung away to settle down beside the cold hearth and set to work lighting a fire. She told herself it was natural that he had come here to ask about Rachel. She and Rachel had been starring together in the Covent Garden production of As You Like It. He would know that. There was no reason to worry that he knew anything else. According to word on the streets, Rachel's maid is saying she went to St. Matthew's last night to meet you. Kat glanced back at him. Did she? He shook his head. They say they found your pistol on her body. Really? His eyes opened a fraction wider, but that was the only reaction he betrayed. How curious. When had he become so adept, she wondered, at hiding his feelings? They also say the constable you stabbed still lives, although he won't for long. Did you know? I didn't stab him. Just like you didn't kill Rachel? A corner of his mouth twitched. If you really believed I'd killed Rachel York, you'd be swinging that poker at my head. Kat sat back on her heels, the poker idle in her hands, her gaze on the man beside the window. Why do you want to know about Rachel? Because it seems to me that the only hope I have of working my way out of this wretched tangle is to discover who the hell did kill her. He went to the table where she kept a brandy decanter, poured himself a drink, and knocked it back in one long pull. Any ideas as to who might have wanted to see Rachel York dead? She'd thought about it, of course. Thought about who, besides Leo and his associates, could have been responsible. Rachel hadn't been particularly well liked amongst the theatrical community. She'd been too focused and driven, and too successful, not to stir up petty resentments and rivalries. But Kat could think of only one man angry enough and violent-tempered enough to attack a woman so brutally, so passionately. There is someone. Kat paused, then said the name in a rush. Hugh Gordon. Devlin looked around in surprise. Hugh Gordon? A tall, darkly handsome man with a deep voice and the ability to move an audience to tears with a simple gesture. Hugh Gordon was London's most popular male actor since John Kemble. Rachel caught his eye her first day at the theatre. She was flattered, of course. He helped her career enormously when she was starting out. She may even have fallen in love with him, for all I know. There was talk at one point of marriage, but then he became more possessive, controlling, more violent. You mean he hit her? Kat nodded. She left him after about a year. Devlin reached for the decanter. I don't imagine a man with Hugh Gordon's amour-propre would take kindly to that. He threatened to kill her. You think he could do a thing like this? I honestly don't know. He poured another drink, then simply stood there regarding it thoughtfully. What about the men in her life since Gordon? Beside her, the coals glowed red-hot with warmth. Kat kept her gaze trained on the fire. She's had flirtations with a number of men, from Lord Grimes to Admiral Worth, but I don't think any man has had her in his keeping. She was aware of his assessing gaze upon her. Do you know what part of the country she was originally from? Some village in Worcestershire. I don't remember the name. Her father was the vicar there, but he died when she was about 13 and she was thrown onto the parish. They apprenticed her as a housemaid to a local merchant. Kat paused. It was one of the things the two women had in common, the similarity of their pasts. The shared memory of wheals left by a whip on bare, tender young flesh, of rough hands, bruising, struggling, frantic wrists, the sharp thrust of pain, and the dull, endless ache of a humiliation and degradation that went on and on. Kat set aside the fireplace tools with a clatter and stood up. When she was 15, she ran away. He was watching Kat closely. He knew some of what had happened to her after her mother and father had been killed, more than she'd ever told anyone else. That's when she came to London. Of course,
said Kat, keeping her voice steady, like all young girls hoping to start a new life. It was an old story of young women, sometimes girls as young as 8 or 9, tricked into the flesh trade by the legion of procuresses who preyed on the innocent and the vulnerable. Rachel had fallen into one's clutches before she'd even left the stagecoach. You met her when she started at the theatre. Kat shook her head, a soft, sad smile tugging at her lips. We met on London Bridge. It was December, if I remember correctly. A few days before Christmas. I talked her out of jumping. And found her work as an actress. Kat shrugged. She was bright, with a good accent, and exactly the kind of face and body men like. She was a natural. So what was she doing at St. Matthew's of the Fields on Tuesday night? Do you know? Kat shook her head. I wouldn't have said she was religious. He came toward her, those strange amber eyes fixed uncomfortably on her face. What aren't you telling me? Kat gave a soft, practiced laugh. I can't think what you mean. He reached out, his fingertips hovering just above her cheek, as if he'd meant to touch her, then thought better of it. You're afraid of something? What? She forced herself to stand very, very still. Of course I'm afraid. Rachel and I share many of the same friends and associates. She watched his lips move as he spoke. The Kat Boleyn I knew didn't scare so easily. Maybe you didn't know her as well as you thought you did. Obviously not, he said dryly, and turned away. How well did you know Rachel? I was probably closer to her than anyone, but even I didn't know her all that well. Kat paused, struggling to put some of what he needed to know into words. Rachel might have been only 18, but life had scarred her, toughened her. There was a calculating side to her. She could be cold, ruthless even if she had to be. You two had much in common, did you not? A stab of hurt his words brought was so swift and unexpected it nearly stole Kat's breath. She hadn't thought he still possessed the power to touch her heart, hadn't thought that anyone did. She glanced toward the hall. The house was silent, a hush broken only by the clatter of a horse's hooves on the street outside, and the mingling cries of the street vendors. Cheers to mint, and buy my trap, buy a rat trap. You shouldn't be here, she said. He smiled then, a faint narrowing gleam of the eyes that she remembered only too well. What's the matter? Afraid Lord Stornley will awaken and find you gone? I shouldn't think he'll stir for another hour or more. How did you know that he's here? I saw his walking stick and top hat in the entry. The walking stick and top hat might have told Devlin she had company, but it wouldn't have given him the name of the man in her bed. That information, she knew, he must have acquired beforehand. It shouldn't have mattered. She told herself she didn't care. And yet, disconcertingly, she did. So you came via the entry, did you? She said, keeping her voice light. He had a habit, she was noticing, of answering her questions with one of his own. Where did Rachel keep her rooms? Dorset Court. But you can't go there, she added quickly, if that's what you're thinking. Why not? If this maid is saying Rachel went to St. Matthew's to meet me, I need to know why. The authorities are watching the house. He tilted his head, his puzzled gaze searching her face. How do you know that? She knew that because Leo had come to the theatre last night after the performance and told her. Under the circumstances, it wouldn't be prudent, he'd said, for him to be seen there. And so he had come to Kat with a request, framed as a suggestion, that Kat might have her own reasons for making certain that Rachel had left behind nothing incriminating. It's known. She paused, then said with studied casualness, I could go there myself, talk to the maid, perhaps even look around and see what I can find. Rachel kept an appointment book. That might tell us something. He came to stand before her. You?
She lifted her head to meet his gaze. It had occurred to Kat that in Devlin she just might have found a potentially valuable ally, someone who had even more interest than she in tracking down the man who had met Rachel in that church. The trick would be in seeing that he learned what was needed to catch Rachel's killer, but nothing more. "You know I can do it," she said. He knew. He knew about the years she had spent as a young girl in one of London's most notorious rookeries, training as a pickpocket, and a thief, and a whore. She thought he might refuse. Instead, he said, "All right, although I can't help but wonder why." "For Auld Lang Syne," she suggested. "Maybe. And maybe because you're scared, even if you won't say why." She thought for a moment that this time he would touch her. Then a faint thump from overhead drew her gaze toward the hall. "You must go," she said quickly. "Come by tomorrow morning early. I'll tell you then what I've learned." "Uh-huh." A hint of amusement deepened the lines beside his mouth. "I'll find you." She let a slow smile spread across her face. "Why, don't you trust me?" "Would you?" Kat's smile faded. Once she had told him she loved him more than life itself and would never, ever let him go. And then she told him it was all a lie, and hurt him so badly it had torn a hole in her own heart. "No," she said, and turned toward the stairs, leaving him standing alone in the cold morning light. Chapter 14. Sir Henry Lovejoy took his position as Chief Magistrate of Queen Square very, very seriously. He often came into the public office early to go over his case notes and to study reprints of the decisions of his fellow magistrates. It was a product of his upbringing, he supposed. That and the habit of industry. Born of solidly respectable tradesman stock, Lovejoy had decided in midlife to become a magistrate only after having amassed a tidy independence as a merchant. Not a fortune, but a comfortable independence. It was a shift in direction he hadn't undertaken lightly, for Lovejoy was a methodical man who never did anything without prolonged and careful thought. He'd a number of reasons for this change in vocation, not the least of which was his conviction that a childless man ought to leave something worthwhile behind him, some contribution to society. And Sir Henry Lovejoy was, now, a childless man. He was sitting at his desk, a muffler wrapped around his neck to ward off the morning chill, when Edward Maitland appeared in the open doorway and said, "3 Bow Street runners had Devlin trapped at an old inn on Pudding Row near St. Giles." "And?" said Lovejoy, looking up from his notes. "He went out a window and escaped over the roof." Lovejoy sat back in his chair and peeled his eyeglasses off his nose. "I've sent some of the lads over there to have a look around," said Maitland, "although I dare say there's not much point." "Interesting." Lovejoy chewed the earpiece of his spectacles. "Why do you suppose he's still in London? No place else to bolt, I expect. A man of Devlin's resources?" Lovejoy shook his head. "Hardly. How is Constable Simplot?" "Still alive, sir, but he won't last much longer, not with a sucking wound." Lovejoy nodded. The knife had punctured the young man's lung. It would be only a matter of time now. Tipping his chair forward, Lovejoy searched amongst the litter on his desk. "What, precisely, have you discovered about this Rachel York?" "What is there to find out?" Lovejoy pressed his lips together and refrained from pointing out that if he'd known the answer to that question, they wouldn't have needed to discover it. "You searched her rooms, of course?" "First thing yesterday morning, when we spoke to the maid." Maitland shrugged. "There was nothing of interest. I left one of the lads there, like you ordered, to watch the place overnight." "A waste of time and resources," his tone said clearly, although he would never voice such a thought aloud.
Lovejoy gave up looking for his schedule.
"When am I due in court this morning?"
"At 10, sir."
"Not enough time," muttered Lovejoy. "I'll have to clear my docket for this afternoon, then."
"Sir?"
said Maitland. "There are certain aspects of this case which disturb me, Constable. It warrants looking into further, and I intend to begin by viewing that unfortunate young woman's rooms myself. Something is going on here. I might not know what it is yet, but there's one thing I do know."
Lovejoy stuck his spectacles back on his nose.
"I know. I don't like it."
Chapter 15. Lady Amanda Wilcox didn't discover that her brother Sebastian was wanted for the murder of an actress named Rachel York until the day after his infamous flight across London. With the season not yet properly underway, she had opted for a quiet evening at home in the company of her 16-year-old daughter Stephanie. Neither her son Bayard nor his father, both of whom had presumably heard the news, having spent the night on the town, bothered to inform her of the scandal. And so it wasn't until Thursday morning, when she came down for breakfast and found the Morning Post folded beside her place, as per her staff's standing instructions, that Amanda learned of the social disaster looming over her family. She was still at the breakfast table, drinking a cup of tea and staring at the Post, when her father, the Earl of Hendon, was announced. He hurried into the breakfast parlour, still wrapped in his street coat and hat, and bringing with him an unpleasant medley of smells, of freezing rain and coal-smoke-choked fog. His fleshy face was haggard, his mouth slack, his eyes red-rimmed and puffy. He fixed her with a desperate stare and demanded without preamble,
"Has he contacted you? Has he?"
"If you mean Sebastian," said Amanda, pausing to take a calm sip of her tea, "I should rather think not." Hendon swung away, one hand coming up to shield his eyes, such a great sigh rumbling from his chest that she was embarrassed for him.
"My God! Where is he? Why hasn't he sought help from any of his friends or family?"
Amanda folded the paper and set it to one side. "Presumably because he knows his family." He turned to face her again, his hand falling slowly to his side.
"I will do anything within my power to help him."
"Then you're a fool." His fierce blue gaze met hers and held it.
"He is my son."
Amanda was the first to look away. "Of course," she said dryly. "There is that." She pushed back her chair and stood up. "The only redeeming feature I can see to all of this is that since he was bound to disgrace us eventually, at least he had the courtesy to do it this year. Hopefully the worst of the scandal will have died down by next season, when Stephanie makes her come out."
"Is that all you can think of?"
"Stephanie is my daughter. What else should I be thinking of?" He regarded her thoughtfully for a long, intense moment.
"I always knew you and Sebastian weren't close. I suppose that was inevitable, given the number of years between you. But I don't think I realized until now just how much you hate him."
"You know why," she said, her voice a harsh tear.
"Yes, but if I can see my way to forget it, then why in the name of God can't you?"
He turned away.
"Give my best to my grandchildren," he said over his shoulder, and left.
Amanda waited until she heard the front door close behind her father. Then she picked up the morning's edition of the Post and went upstairs to her husband's dressing-room. The Wilcox family was an ancient one, older even than the St. Cyrs, and long known for their staid respectability. Far from squandering his wealth on the turf or at cards in the manner of so many of his peers, Martin, the 12th Baron Wilcox, had taken what had once been merely a comfortable land-based inheritance, and by judicial investments in a trading company and various other profitable wartime speculations, turned it into a sizable fortune. Some women might have been appalled by their noble husbands dabbling in commerce. Not Amanda.
The Earl of Hendon's daughter understood well that while one's claim to gentility would always come from land, financial security and the future of wealth lay elsewhere. Amanda had married Lord Wilcox at the end of her second season. She'd rarely had cause to regret her decision. She found him seated before his dressing-table, engaged in the very serious business of tying his cravat. Martin Wilcox might be just shy of 50, with grey threading his receding brown hair and heavy jowls framing his thin lips, but like most members of the Prince's set, he was a very careful dresser. After one look at his wife's face, he dismissed his valet with a curt nod. She tossed the open post onto the dressing-table before him. "You might have told me." Wilcox kept his gaze on his reflection in the glass. "You had retired for the evening," he said, as if that were the only explanation required. And indeed it was, for it had been some 15 years since Amanda had allowed Wilcox past the door to her bedchamber. Not that he could complain that she hadn't done her duty by him. In the first 6 years of their marriage, she had presented him with first Bayard, then a daughter, and a second son. It was only then, having produced the requisite heir and a spare, that Amanda had barred her husband from her bed. The youngest child had died in its 7th year, but Amanda hadn't been inclined to reverse her decision, and Wilcox, never one to make excessive demands upon his wife, had forborne to press her. Bayard was healthy enough, in body at least, if not in mind. "My father was here this morning," she said, going to stand in the centre of the room, her arms crossed at her chest. "And?" Leaning forward to study his image in the mirror, Wilcox began to make careful adjustments to the folds of his neckcloth with his fingers. "Does he know where Devlin is?" "No. He thought I might." Wilcox grunted. "If your brother has any sense, he's fled the country by now. Nasty piece of work this, from the sounds of it. I always knew Devlin could be violent, but—" He paused, tilting his head this way and that as he studied his reflection. "I must say I never expected something like this. The scandals he's forced us to endure in the past were nothing compared to this." Amanda let out a scornful huff. "Don't be ridiculous. Sebastian didn't murder that woman." He glanced up, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror, his habitual faint smile curving his lips. "So certain, my dear. You do realize who this dead actress was, don't you?" Opening a Chinese lacquered jewel box, Wilcox considered its contents, then selected a diamond and 2 gold fobs. Martin always wore too much jewellery. "Should I?" he said, hanging one of the fobs from his watch chain. "You might, if you paid more attention to your son and heir. Rachel York is the woman Bayard has been making such an exhibition of himself over since before Christmas." Wilcox slipped the ring on his finger. "So?" "So? What if the case against Sebastian falls apart, and the authorities start investigating this woman's death? What then?" "So?" he said again. "There's no harm in a healthy young man admiring a beautiful woman, especially when the woman in question trades on that beauty and uses it to entice and to entrap. If the authorities are going to suspect every London buck who ever lusted after that woman, believe me, they'll have a very long list." Amanda started to say something, then didn't. "Besides," he continued, "if anyone asks, I've only to tell them that Bayard was with me Tuesday night." Amanda stared at her husband's bland, untroubled face. "And if he really did do it, Martin? You're worried about the scandal my brother has caused. What if it turns out to be Bayard?" Wilcox stood up, his jowly face slowly darkening. "What precisely are you saying? That you think your own 21-year-old son capable of a crime you don't believe your rake hell of a brother could have committed?" Amanda met his angry gaze, her own jaw tight. You and I both know what Bayard is like."
"I told you," said Wilcox, with more force than usual. "Bayard was with me."
"Well, what a relief. We've nothing to worry about then," she said dryly, and left the room. Chapter 16. He possessed a knack, Sebastian had discovered during his years in the army, for play-acting, for accents and mimicry and all the subtle nuances of behaviour and attitude that could be used to impersonate and deceive. He also knew that, in general, people saw what they expected to see, that men looking for an absconding nobleman wouldn't peer too closely at a humble vicar or an honest shopkeeper in cheap linen and a poorly cut drab coat. And so, after leaving Cat Bullen's elegant little townhouse, he made his way to the rag fair in Rosemary Lane, where he bought a set of second-hand clothes, a drab topcoat, and a rusty black round hat. He stopped at several small shops where he made an assortment of other purchases. Then, wrapped in his new topcoat, with the round hat pulled low to hide his tawny eyes, he took a room at a respectable but simple inn called the Rose and Crown, and set about transforming himself into someone else entirely. Sebastian tipped his head first one way, then the other, surveying his reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Mr. Simon Taylor, he thought he'd be called. He had little sense of style, Mr. Taylor, with his badly cut hair, old-fashioned coat, and poorly tied cravat. With practised care, Sebastian used chalk dust to add a few streaks of grey to his dark, newly chopped hair. After months of drifting aimlessly, of living a life at once privileged and predictable, and always inevitably, unbearably boring, he was conscious of a faint stirring of interest, of excitements such as he hadn't known since he'd left the army 10 months before. He found Hugh Gordon in a corner booth of the crumbling old red-brick pub known as the Green Man, that had been popular with the theatrical crowd since the days when Elizabeth was queen. The actor was alone, a tall, elegant man drinking a pint of ale and eating a simple ploughman's lunch. His entire posture spoke of self-possession and arrogance, and a pronounced desire to be left alone. Shuffling up to the table, Sebastian pulled off his hat and held it awkwardly, humbly even, before his breast. "Mr. Hugh Gordon?" Gordon looked up, his dark brows drawing together into a frown. Even off stage his manner was theatrical, his voice stentorian. "Yes?" Sebastian tightened his hold on his hat brim. "Pardon me for being so bold as to introduce myself, but I am Taylor, Mr. Simon Taylor." Sebastian brought the inflection of his voice up at the end, in the manner of one so unsure of himself that even simple sentences come out sounding like questions. "From Worcestershire? I said at the theatre I might find you here." Reaching out, Gordon took a slow sip of his ale. "So?" Sebastian swallowed, working his Adam's apple visibly up and down. "I'm endeavouring to locate a young relative of my mother's, a Miss Rachel York. I was hoping you might be able to provide me with her direction." "Do you mean to say you haven't heard?" The timbre of his voice was deep and rich, the intonation flawless. If Gordon hadn't been born a gentleman, he'd certainly done a good job of cultivating both the image and accent. Sebastian looked confused. "I beg your pardon?" "She's dead." "Dead?" Sebastian staggered as if reeling beneath the shock and sat down on the bench opposite the actor. "Good heavens! I had no idea. When did this happen?" "They found her in an old church off Great Peter Street, near the Abbey, yesterday morning. Someone had slit her pretty little throat." There was no sorrow in the statement, only a faint lingering of animosity that Sebastian noted with interest, although he was careful to keep all trace of the observation off his face. "Oh, this is dreadful. Any idea who did it?"
Some knob.
Gordon stuffed a forkful of beef in his mouth and spoke around it.
Oh, so they say.
I am so sorry. This must be very hard for you. Gordon paused with another forkful halfway to his face.
For me? What's that supposed to mean?
I was under the impression that you and Rachel were— Sebastian cleared his throat. Well, you know.
Gordon grunted. Your information is out of date, my friend. There have been any number of gentlemen who've visited her pleasure palace since me. I can tell you that.
It was a crude and decidedly unlover-like expression. Sebastian drew a deep breath, his chest lifting in a soulful sigh.
My mother always feared the girl would end up as common Haymarket wear.
Gordon snorted.
Nothing common about Rachel. Hell, a man would need to be a lord or a bloody nabob at least to get past her ivory gates these days.
And there, thought Sebastian, lay the source of at least some of this man's resentment toward his former mistress. When she'd been young and just starting out in the theatrical world, Gordon's status as one of the titans of the stage must have made him seem powerful, even godlike to her. But once Rachel had established a reputation of her own, and attracted the attention of some of London's wealthiest noblemen, she'd obviously decided she could do better than a common actor, especially one with a tendency to use his fists on her. Gordon took a long, deep drink from his tankard.
She used to talk about the day their noble heads would end up on pikes, and how London's gutters were going to run with their precious blue blood.
He gave a low, mirthless laugh.
She changed her tune quick enough, didn't she, when they started buying her silks and pearls?
So, Rachel Yorke had sympathized with the aims of the French Revolution. Interesting, thought Sebastian. He shook his head soulfully.
And now one of these noblemen has murdered her? So they say. Although, if you ask me, the authorities ought to be taking a closer look at that bloody Frenchman.
She had a French lover?
Lover?
Gordon shoved the last of his bread in his mouth, chewed once or twice, and swallowed hard.
I don't know if I'd call him that, although the man was paying the rent on her rooms all right.
What man is this?
One of those bloody emigres. Claims to be the son of a count or some such nonsense.
The flawless accent slipped for a moment, allowing a hint of Geordie to peek through. Pushing away his plate, the actor leaned back and dusted the crumbs off his fingers.
Man by the name of Pierpont. Leo Pierpont.
Chapter 17. Sir Henry Lovejoy had two passions left in his life. One was for justice and the law, the other was for science. Whenever he could, he attended the public lectures given at the Royal Scientific Society. He read the Scientific Quarterly, and he tried very, very hard to apply the scientific method to his investigations and legal deliberations. But every once in a while, Lovejoy went with his instincts and played a hunch. It was his instincts that kept nagging at him over this latest killing, whispering to him that there had to be more to Rachel Yorke's murder in the Lady Chapel of St. Matthew of the Fields than Constable Edward Maitland had so far discovered. And so, late that afternoon, Lovejoy sought out Viscount Devlin's friend and erstwhile second, Sir Christopher Farrell, in Brooks's Club on St. James's, and set about finding out more about the Earl of Hendon's infamous rake-hell son, Sebastian.
Tell me about yesterday morning's duel between Lord Devlin and Captain John Talbot, said Lovejoy, when Sir Christopher joined him in the discreet little room tucked away at the top of the stairs that the club had provided for them. He was an unexpectedly open-faced man, Sir Christopher, with clear grey eyes and an easy manner. Nothing at all like what Lovejoy would have expected in a friend of someone as dark and saturnine as Devlin. At Lovejoy's question, he opened his eyes wide in a studied parody of innocence.
Duel?
What duel?
The room contained a large mahogany table, surrounded by some half-dozen chairs upholstered in the same blue brocade as the walls. Lovejoy stood with the table between them, his gaze fixed on the other man's face.
You do your friend no favour, Sir Christopher. I have little interest at the moment in enforcing the codes against duelling, but 2 days ago a young woman named Rachel York was brutally assaulted and murdered, and certain evidence, combined with accounts from a witness, have implicated Lord Devlin. Therefore, the more we know about his lordship's movements these last few days, the closer we will be to understanding the truth of this matter. If you have any information which is pertinent, it would behoove you to provide it. So I ask you again, who was the challenger? Lord Devlin?
Sir Christopher hesitated a moment, then shook his head.
No. Talbot. When and where precisely was this challenge issued?
Farrell went to look out the window, his hands clasped behind his back. It was a moment before he answered, his words coming out jerkily, as if he begrudged the magistrate each and every one.
Tuesday afternoon, at White's. Sebastian was standing near the entrance to the gaming room, holding a glass of wine. Talbot jostled him in such a way that wine from Sebastian's glass splashed onto Talbot's boots. He demanded satisfaction.
Lovejoy nodded in understanding.
That was the public justification for the duel. Now tell me the real reason.
Farrell swung around, one eyebrow arching in aristocratic affront.
I beg your pardon?
Lovejoy returned only a tight, bland smile.
There are those who say Lord Devlin was having an affair with Captain Talbot's wife.
Sir Christopher met Lovejoy's questioning gaze, and Lovejoy thought,
the man must be hopeless at the gaming tables. Everything he considered, everything he felt, showed on his face.
Lovejoy knew the precise moment when Farrell decided to let go of his resistance. Blowing out his breath in a long sigh, he came to sit in one of the chairs ringing the centre table.
Talbot certainly thought so, he said,
propping his elbows on the table and sinking his chin into his hands.
But it wasn't true. Devlin's relationship with Melanie Talbot never went beyond friendship. You believe that?
Sir Christopher nodded glumly.
Last spring, at a ball at Devonshire House, Sebastian heard someone crying in the garden. He's got the damnedest hearing a body could ever imagine, you know. Anyway, he went to investigate and found Talbot's wife. The bastard had taken exception to the way she was looking at one of the violin players, and worked her over pretty bad before storming off in a fit. Sebastian took her home. But that wasn't the end of it.
Farrell dropped his hands into his lap and sat back.
No. She needed a friend, and Devlin became one. I always thought she was more than half in love with him, but Devlin's not the kind of man to take advantage of another person's vulnerability.
Lovejoy eyed the other man consideringly.
How well do you know him?
A slow, unexpectedly boyish smile spread across Sir Christopher's face.
Better than I know either of my own 2 brothers. Sebastian and I were at Eton together, and Oxford after that. But you didn't join the army with him?
Sir Christopher's smile faded.
No. I didn't even know what he'd done till the day before he was set to leave England. A bit of a start, that, was it not?
Sir Christopher fell into a troubled silence, as if considering his next words. Then he said,
About a year after we came down from Oxford, Sebastian fell in love with a woman the Earl considered unsuitable. He threatened to cut Sebastian off without a penny if he married the chit. Lord Hendon objected to the lady's birth.
Farrell rubbed his nose.
She was a Cyprian. Ah, said Lovejoy.
It was difficult to imagine the proud, arrogant young man he'd first met in the library at Brook Street doing anything so improper or foolish as to fall in love with an incognita.
But then it must have all happened long ago. One wondered how much, if any, of that impetuous romantic youth could still be found in the cool, hard man Lord Devlin was today. Sebastian swore he'd marry the girl anyway. Only the lady in question had no interest in marrying a pauper. Once she realized Hendon meant what he'd said, she broke it off. So Devlin went to war to get himself killed. I'm not so sure it was as dramatic as all that. Let's just say he was anxious to get away from England for a spell. Understandable, said Lovejoy smoothly. Yet I gather he volunteered for some rather dangerous assignments. He was in intelligence, if that's what you mean. He was good at it. Lovejoy made a non-committal humming sound. So I've heard. Yet I understand he left the service last year under something of a cloud. What was that about, I wonder? Sir Christopher returned Lovejoy's questioning look with a mulish stare. I don't know anything about that, he said, and on this, it seemed, Sir Christopher would not be drawn. Lovejoy shifted his approach. Did you see Lord Devlin this last Tuesday evening? Of course. Sir Christopher's eyes remained narrowed. The man might be easy-going, Lovejoy thought, but he was no fool. He knew to what end Lovejoy was circling back around. We were at Watier's all night, until dawn the next morning, when we drove out to Chalk Heath. Lovejoy gave a tight smile. Yes, but you see, it is his lordship's movements earlier in the evening we're interested in. According to our information, Lord Devlin didn't arrive at Watier's until shortly after 9 o'clock, although he left his house some 4 hours earlier, approximately 5. His lordship claims he spent the intervening 4 hours simply walking the streets of London, but unfortunately he says he was alone. Sir Christopher set his jaw and glared back at Lovejoy. If Devlin says he was out walking, then that's where he was. The man had too open a face and too natural a disposition toward honesty, Lovejoy thought, to ever be anything other than a terrible liar. A magistrate spent the next 10 minutes pressing Sir Christopher for the truth, but in the end Lovejoy gave it up. He'd have better luck, he decided, with the unhappily married Melanie Talbot.